Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from, also what time is it. It started with a sound no one could explain. The signal was faint, but it didn't belong to any known satellite, no frequency that matched a military relay, weather balloon, or rogue radio broadcast. It had a rhythm, a pulse, like something breathing, alive. It slipped into the static like a whisper through a graveyard fog, and those who heard it never quite forgot it. It was first picked up by a deep space observatory in northern Alaska, nestled between mountains and silence, where the night seemed longer and shadows clung to the snow like secrets too cold to tell. The observatory, known only as Station Thorn, was supposed to be dormant, decommissioned 5 years ago, left to freeze and rot like a mausoleum of forgotten science. But someone had been there. The transmission logs proved that much. Power readings spiked at irregular intervals. Lights flickered in unison with the signal's pulses. And then, the distress call came through. 3 words. Just 3 words, spoken in a voice that shouldn't have existed. Don't come here. Erica Vale had read the transcript a dozen times before the chopper blades tore through the air overhead, lowering her and her team onto the frozen landing pad of Station Thorn. A hard wind screamed across the tundra, dragging the cold into her bones and leaving a taste of rust in her throat. The station squatted beneath them, like something exhumed rather than built, its antennas crooked, windows rimmed with frost, and the heavy steel doors shut tight. Her team was small. It had to be. Too many people would attract too much attention. There was Dr. Malcolm Reyes, a linguist obsessed with encrypted signals and ancient languages, Kara Bloom, an engineer with a past sealed behind classified files, and Thomas Rourke, the kind of man who never asked questions but always carried a loaded sidearm. They weren't told everything. Just that a relay caught something strange, and Thornan, a station that should have been dead, had come back online for 6 minutes and 13 seconds. During that time, the signal played. Then silence. But the doors were unlocked remotely shortly after. That shouldn't have been possible. There was no one alive authorized to do that, no one who should still have access. And yet someone, or something, had opened the gates. The first thing that hit them when they entered was the smell. It wasn't death, not exactly. It was old, metallic, and damp, like the inside of a tomb sealed with rust. The air was thick with dust that hadn't been disturbed in years, yet the lights flickered on without hesitation. Someone had kept the generator running, or restarted it. That meant they weren't alone. Check the logs, Erica told Kara, who was already at the main terminal, her fingers moving fast. And isolate the transmission source if you can. Rourke swept the room, eyes never resting too long on any one corner. The place was too still, too quiet. Not abandoned, waiting. Got something, Kara muttered. But this doesn't make sense. What doesn't? Erica asked, stepping closer. The station wasn't just powered on. It's been running maintenance cycles. Self-diagnostics. Climate regulation. Someone's been here recently enough to stop the pipes from freezing. But there's no record of them arriving or leaving. Nothing on the door logs. Ghosts, Malcolm said with a grin, though there was no humor in his voice. He stood near the central console where an old reel-to-reel recording system was still in place. I've heard of this. Residual signal behavior. Or something left behind mimicking life. Erica shook her head. Ghosts don't type passcodes. Ghosts don't warm up generators. But she was wrong. Ghosts did more than that here. They set up camp in the central operations room. Sleeping bags unrolled, heat lamps activated, and weapons checked. Erica didn't sleep. She sat with the headphones on, listening to the recording. That signal. The one that brought them here. It didn't sound mechanical. There were harmonics. Natural ones. The kind you'd hear in a voice, not a machine. Worse, when she slowed it down, it almost sounded like a chant, or a name. She played it again, eyes fixed on the waveform. It pulsed in threes, like a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. She didn't realize Malcolm had joined her until he spoke. It's a warning. I'm certain of it now. You can't be sure. No, he replied, but I recognize the pattern. It's the same in certain pre-Sumerian dialects. A linguistic signature. There's a repeated suffix that only ever meant one thing. What? Death. Rourke found the first body the next morning. It wasn't whole. It was fused into the wall, like melted wax pressed against concrete. A face was stretched across a steel panel in the maintenance corridor, eyes wide, mouth opened in a frozen scream. But no bones. No organs. Just a shell. The flesh was dry, like paper, flaking at the edges. Impossible, Kara muttered, touching it with a gloved hand. There's no sign of trauma. No heat damage. It's like he just became part of the wall. Who is he? Erica asked. ID badge says Harold Tane. He was one of the original techs when Thorn was built. Went missing during decommissioning. That was 5 years ago. Yeah, Rourke said, and he looks fresh. They started searching every room after that. Each one felt more wrong than the last. It wasn't the dust or the silence. It was the way things had been arranged. A mug left with warm coffee. A chair pulled back like someone had just stood. A shower still dripping, like someone had stepped away just before they arrived. But no footsteps. No fingerprints. No sign of life or death. Until they found the room with the writing. It was on the walls, ceiling, and floor, scratched deep into the surface with nails or knives. Symbols. Circles inside triangles. Shapes that seemed to shift when looked at too long. And in the center, burned into the wall with something hotter than any blowtorch, was a phrase WUP open edit ITF from BL. What did they open? Malcolm whispered that night, huddled by the fire they made from broken furniture and old research logs. Nothing's under Thorn, Kara insisted. It's solid rock. I checked the schematics. Erica didn't answer. She was looking at the printout Malcolm had given her from the signal decryption. The last few characters weren't linguistic. They were coordinates. Coordinates that pointed not above, but down. There's something beneath the station, she finally said. Something sealed. What do you think they did? Kara asked. Erica looked at her. I think they tried to talk to it. And that was the moment the lights went out. The darkness wasn't empty. They heard the first voice then, echoing through the vents like a child whispering in the dark. It spoke in pulses like the signal, a voice broken into 1,000 echoes. Help me, help me, help me. But it wasn't human, it wasn't desperate, it was bait. Rourke swept the hallway with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the black like a scalpel. It didn't help. The walls seemed to breathe in the dark. Shadows shifted against gravity, and then something screamed. Not from the hallway, from the recording room. They ran, but they weren't fast enough. Malcolm was gone. All that remained was his recorder, still spinning, still playing back what he'd last captured. Erica picked it up with shaking hands. She listened. It was the signal again, slowed down, broken apart. But this time, over the pulse, there was another sound. A voice. Malcolm's. He was screaming a single word over and over again. Run. That night, Erica locked herself in the control room and reviewed the satellite feed. There, buried beneath the snow and ice under Thorn Station, she found the shape. It was perfectly round, over 100 feet wide, and old. Older than any human structure, yet too perfect to be natural. Buried deep and pulsing, like a heartbeat. Thump. 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 They hadn't received a signal. They'd heard it breathing, and it had heard them back. The wind never truly stopped at Station Thorn. Even with reinforced shutters and every door sealed, the sound found a way in. A low moaning that echoed through every corridor and crevice like something mourning just beneath the surface. After Malcolm vanished, the station felt different, colder, heavier, like the structure itself had noticed their loss and was bracing for what came next. Erica Vale barely spoke, as she listened to his final screams again and again, memorizing every crack in his voice, every breath cut short, every frantic syllable that told her the truth: they were being hunted. The next morning didn't bring daylight, just a dull gray smothering the windows, and Kara's expression matched it. She hadn't slept. None of them had. Rourke paced the main corridor like a soldier waiting for a war he didn't understand, eyes sunken, hand never straying far from his weapon. When Erica gathered them near the mission board, there was no pretense anymore. "There's something under us," she said, her voice brittle. "Not a person. Not a thing we were meant to find." Kara didn't look up. "You saw the structure, didn't you?" Erica nodded. The satellite picked it up, buried deep beneath the ice. Not listed on any map, not mentioned in any of the logs. Malcolm's signal coordinates led straight to it. The station was built on top of it. On purpose. Rourke asked. "I think someone knew it was down there. I think the people who built Thorn weren't just watching the skies." Kara finally looked at Erica, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You think they were trying to wake it up?" The silence that followed was worse than any wind. They needed answers. Real ones. Not data. Not signals. Something solid. And there was only one place left that might give them what they were looking for. The sub-basement. A level not on the blueprints. One Kara discovered by accident while scanning the old schematics for power fluctuations. It wasn't listed under living quarters or storage. It had no name, just a locked hatch beneath the east wing, a hatch that was now open. Erica descended first. The ladder was slick with condensation, the air below thick and metallic, like old blood. The others followed in tense silence, their breath visible in short, ragged clouds. The sub-basement was colder than the rest of the station, unnaturally so. Pipes lined the ceiling, but none of them were active. No heating. No circulation, just cold, hard silence. Then the lights flickered on. It wasn't triggered by them. No motion sensors. No switch. The room simply woke up. One by one, overhead fluorescents buzzed to life, casting pale light over metal cabinets, ancient-looking machines. And something that took Erica a long moment to process. There were cages. Dozens of them. Each no larger than a person, each lined with something soft and black, like moss that moved when you looked away. Some cages were open, some locked, and some held shapes. Not corpses, not exactly, not anymore. Kara took a sharp step back, covering her mouth, eyes wide. "Jesus Christ, what is this?" "Testing chambers," Rourke muttered. "I've seen similar layouts in old Cold War facilities. But this isn't military. This is ritual." The walls were covered in carvings, symbols they'd seen before but far more detailed. Layered circles, jagged spirals, inverted eyes. None of them meant anything by themselves, but together they hummed with a suggestion of meaning, like words in a language too old to remember. Erica approached one of the cages slowly, drawn to it despite the bile rising in her throat. Inside was something twisted beyond anatomy. It might have once been a man, broad shoulders, human jawline, but its limbs were too long, fingers fused into a single smooth surface, mouth stretched into an O that spoke of agony and awe in equal parts. And its eyes had no color, just black pits that reflected nothing, not even the light. "Why is this down here?" Kara asked. "Because they were trying to change people," Erica said, almost to herself. "They weren't just communicating. They were experimenting." "With what?" Rourke demanded. Erica turned toward him. "With whatever's beneath us." They found the first journal buried under a loose panel beneath one of the workstations. It belonged to Dr. Alara Miles, one of the original scientists assigned to Thorn's construction, and someone whose name had been scrubbed from every record. Her handwriting was steady, almost graceful, but the content slipped further into chaos with every entry. Day 12. The pulses continue. Stronger now. The walls feel softer. I dream in spirals. Day 30. Patient Salar 3 spoke today. But it wasn't his voice, it was hers, the one in the ice. The one that calls. Day 48. We tried to send a signal back. She didn't like that. The wall's blood. Day 59. I've locked the lower gate. It's the only way. She must sleep. Then, nothing. The last page was smeared with something brown and dry, not ink. What gate? Kara asked, though the answer was already crawling up her spine. Erica pointed to the map drawn on the inside cover, a crude floor plan of the station. At the very bottom, past the sub-basement, was a circle, labeled only with one word, pit. They had a choice. Leave now, risk the storm, call for extraction, and let the ice claim whatever was left. Or go deeper. Find the pit. Find the truth. Kara wanted to leave. Rourke didn't say it, but his silence said enough. Erica, though, she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not with Malcolm gone. Not with something still breathing under their feet. Whatever this was, it had waited long enough. They followed the path shown in the journal, passing another corridor that hadn't been on any blueprint, behind a sealed bulkhead that Kara managed to override. The metal groaned as it opened, the sound echoing down into darkness as if they were opening a throat. The tunnel led down, no stairs. Just a steep, uneven slope of ice, covered rock, reinforced with old scaffolding and rusted chains. Whoever built it hadn't planned for comfort. They planned to keep something in, or keep others out. The walls of the tunnel were scratched, hundreds of marks, tallies, names, phrases in languages none of them recognized, but one word appeared over and over again in English, carved deep, desperate, sorry. The pit was not a hole, it was a chamber. A natural one, perhaps, or so ancient no one remembered it was ever made. 50 feet across, domed, the ceiling lined with more of those shifting symbols. And at the center, buried under a sheet of black ice, was something massive. Round, pulsing faintly like a heart beating too slowly to live. Wires ran to it from machines no longer functional. Symbols were painted across the ice in what looked like a mix of blood and ash. Rourke stepped forward. That's what they were feeding, with the signal, with the experiments. Erica felt it then, not just in her ears, but in her bones. A deep hum, like a thought too large to think. A presence. It noticed them. Kara dropped to her knees, clutching her head, screaming as blood dripped from her nose. Rourke pulled her back, dragging her away from the ice. Erica stood still, transfixed. And then, the ice cracked. Just a hairline fracture. But it ran straight through the center of the pulsing mass. The humming grew louder. It wasn't a heart. It was an eye, and it was beginning to open. Erica turned, blood freezing in her veins, as she finally understood what the signal had been. It wasn't a warning, it was a countdown, and time had just run out, for a few seconds. Just a few. The world became too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just muffle sound, but devours it, so even your own heartbeat sounds distant, like it belongs to someone else. That was the moment the fracture in the ice grew another inch. It didn't shatter. It didn't scream. It simply widened with purpose, like a lid slowly lifting from something that had never wanted to be seen again. Kara sobbed on the ground, her voice raw and distant, as if she were underwater. Rourke stood above her, breathing hard, weapon drawn, but trembling. He didn't know where to aim. Neither did Erica, because there was no enemy here. There was only awakening. The black sphere beneath the ice continued to pulse. Slow, steady. Thump. 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 But now the pulses had rhythm. Almost language. Not words exactly, but intention. A voice without sound, and every beat spoke one thing: I see you. Erica stumbled backward from the edge, her boots slipping on the frosted stone floor. Her fingers reached for the wall behind her, but found nothing. No comfort, no grip, just symbols beneath her glove that felt hot to the touch. Despite the sub-zero air, the carvings were moving. Not physically, but her eyes couldn't hold their shape. They twisted and coiled like snakes under the skin of the walls. Watching her, she finally found her voice. We need to go. Now, no one argued. Kara was shaking so badly she couldn't stand. Rourke lifted her into a half carry. the barrel of his rifle swaying with each step as they made their way back to the tunnel's edge. But the slope they'd come down was different now. Longer. The scaffolding groaned as they stepped onto it. The chains above swayed, though there was no wind, and behind them, in the pit, a low scraping sound began to build. Something was moving. Erica didn't look back. She couldn't. The air itself seemed to push her forward. Cold one second and hot the next. It smelled of iron and rot, like something ancient exhaling for the first time in 1,000 years. Her skin crawled with it. The sensation wasn't fear, it was recognition. The kind that screams you've been here before, even though you haven't. Not in this life. Not in this world. By the time they reached the bulkhead again, Kara had regained some awareness. Her eyes were bloodshot, and every few seconds she whispered something unintelligible, like a prayer or a countdown of her own. Rourke slammed the override panel, punching the button to seal the bulkhead. The door hesitated before it closed, as if resisting. Then it slammed shut with a metallic scream. A moment later, the floor shook. Not like a quake. More like something huge had shifted beneath them, pushing against the stone like it was nothing more than paper. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Lights flickered, then steadied. Erica helped Kara to her feet, her hands trembling. We lock everything. Every hatch, every door. No one goes near that pit again. Kara wiped blood from her mouth. It's already out. They stared at her. It touched me, she whispered. It's inside. Erica didn't speak. She didn't have to. They all saw it. Kara's pupils were dilated beyond reason. Her voice no longer sounded quite right. It trembled on a frequency that seemed to vibrate in the walls. Something had changed. And deep down, Erica knew it was only the beginning. They barricaded themselves in the operations room again, sealing the doors with steel rods and any equipment they could find. Rourke even wired one of the remaining propane tanks to a makeshift tripwire, muttering that if something was coming, he'd rather greet it with fire than open arms. Erica spent hours at the console, scanning for any signal that could reach the outside world. Nothing worked, not even the emergency beacon. But the station wasn't dead, no. The systems were active, just not responding. The command structure had been rewritten. Kara's fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to find a backdoor. Her voice was low, slurred, but she worked like someone in a trance. Erica should have stopped her, but she needed answers. Needed something to make sense of what they saw. That's when Kara found the hidden files. Thousands of them. Encrypted, buried behind layers of dead code. Unreadable to most, but Kara decrypted them like she was remembering rather than learning. They were logs, experiments, data streams, journals from scientists long since erased from history. And then came the videos. The first showed a subject strapped to a metal chair. A man, young, healthy, sweating and screaming. Electrodes lined his arms and chest. Behind him, a black screen flickered to life, displaying a slow, pulsing signal, the same signal. The subject stopped screaming. His eyes glazed over. Then he began to speak in a language that didn't exist. The second video showed the same man 2 days later. He was no longer in the chair. He was in a cage, smiling. Erica forced herself to watch the next file. It was labeled Protocol Null, Final Attempt. The footage was distorted. Static cut through every few seconds. But what was clear, chillingly so, was the structure under the ice. It wasn't just dormant. It was growing. That night, something walked the halls of Thorn. Erica heard it first. Not footsteps, scraping, like claws dragging along metal. Doors opening and closing by themselves. Lights flickering just ahead of the sound. Rourke sat near the entrance with his rifle trained on the hallway. His finger taut on the trigger. Then the whispers started. Not voices. Not exactly. More like thoughts. Thoughts that didn't belong. Erica heard her own name spoken in her father's voice. Her father who had died when she was 13. She heard laughter too, broken and wet, coming from the ventilation ducts. and she felt something else. Something watching from behind her eyes. Kara was asleep, or unconscious. She hadn't spoken in hours, but her mouth moved in her sleep, forming words Erica couldn't hear. Her fingers twitched like they were still typing. Then the door rattled. It wasn't a bang, just a soft nudge, a testing knock, like someone who didn't need to break in. Someone who had the key. Erica and Rourke stared at it, not breathing. It knocked again, and then a voice, soft, familiar, Malcolm's. "Let me in." Rourke's face turned pale. "It's not him." "No," Erica said, stepping forward. "But it knows how to wear his skin." They didn't sleep again. When morning came, if it was even morning, the lights in the hallway outside the operations room were off. Dead, and in the far end, something was standing. Erica caught a glimpse of it in the reflection of the observation window. Tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too thin. Its head tilted at an angle that suggested a neck broken and never healed. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. Then it was gone. Kara finally spoke again, but it wasn't in English. The words came fast, fluid, like water spilling out of a broken jar. Rourke stepped toward her, but she flinched away, eyes flashing black for a heartbeat before returning to normal. "She's not here anymore," Erica said. "She's infected," Rourke asked. "No, not infected, chosen." Kara turned toward them then, eyes wide, mouth twitching. "It wants to speak to you." Erica's blood froze. "What does?" "The one below. The first mind, the deep thought. It knows you. It remembers you. You were here before." "That's not true." "It is," Kara said. "In the dream, when you fell. When the cold took you, it saw you then, and it never forgot." Erica stumbled back, heart racing. She had fallen once. Off a mountain during a climb 10 years ago. Barely survived. She hadn't told anyone on the team. Kara couldn't have known that. Unless something else had told her. They didn't speak for a long time after that. Kara lay curled in a corner, humming softly to herself. Rourke cleaned his gun in silence, but his hands were shaking. Erica stared at the flickering screen, watching as the signal played on a loop. 3 pulses, a pause, then 3 more. Thump, thump, thump. They had to end it. That was the only answer left. Whatever was under the ice wasn't sleeping anymore. It was reaching, spreading. Thorn wasn't a research station. It was a cocoon. And something inside had started to hatch. Time stopped meaning anything inside Thorn. There were no sunrises, no clocks that could be trusted, no real markers to tell them whether it had been hours or days since the pit cracked open. Erica Vale kept checking her wristwatch like it meant something, but every time she looked, the hands had reset. Midnight. Always midnight. She would blink and the watch would skip backwards. At first, she thought it was the cold. Now she wasn't so sure the concept of time still applied here at all. Kara hadn't moved from the corner since her last outburst. Her humming continued, low and guttural now, the melody falling into sync with the heartbeat of the station itself. Erica could feel it through the walls. That same rhythm, deep and slow. Thump, 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 as if the foundations of Thorn were echoing something far beneath them. Something ancient. Something waking up. Rourke hadn't spoken in hours either. He kept pacing the room, checking his ammo, rubbing his fingers over the trigger guard like it grounded him. But Erica had noticed the changes. The way he tilted his head slightly when no one was speaking. The way he occasionally turned toward walls, as if someone had whispered to him. The way his reflection didn't always match his movements. Something was unspooling inside of all of them. Erica sat with her back to the wall, rifle across her lap, the console screen flickering with static. She'd stopped trying to raise outside contact. If anyone ever received their signal, she figured it would be decades too late. Or maybe the moment they stepped into the pit, they passed into somewhere else entirely, not hell. Not another dimension. Just a deeper place. A forgotten one. A place that existed underneath everything. Something older than language, than gravity, than God. The first mind. That's what Kara had called it. Not in English, not at first. The phrase had been buried in one of the decrypted logs, recorded by Ilara Miles in one of her final journal entries. We reached it. Thought it was an artifact. But it wasn't a relic. It was a remnant. It was a mind. It was waiting. Erica remembered the look on Malcolm's face when he first analyzed the signal. That glimmer of excitement under his fear, the kind of look people got when they discovered something they weren't meant to. She wondered now if he'd known even then, deep down, that this wasn't a discovery. It was an invitation. Or a trap. It started again around what they guessed was nightfall. The scratching. At first it sounded like rats, tiny claws skittering behind the walls, but it grew, louder, more deliberate, not random anymore. It was drawing shapes, lines, circles. Like something with long fingers was etching symbols into the walls from the inside out. Erica gripped her rifle, every nerve in her body screaming to move, to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The pit was sealed, at least she hoped it still was. The upper entrance was buried under snow and ice. The station had become a sealed room, and something had locked the doors from the outside. The scratching stopped. Then came the voice. Not spoken aloud, but inside her head. A whisper that wasn't a whisper. It slid through her thoughts like oil, pushing aside her own inner monologue to make room. Do you remember me? She dropped the rifle. The sound it made hitting the metal floor snapped Rourke out of his trance. He lunged toward her, helping her up, but Erica barely heard him. The voice was still there, not loud but present, patient, as if it had all the time in the world to wait for her to answer. You were the first to fall. I caught you. The mountain. That fall. She was 1,500 feet up, reaching for a ledge, the wind howling against her jacket. The rock had crumbled. She'd fallen for 3 terrifying seconds, long enough to see the jagged outcropping rushing toward her skull. And then nothing. She'd woken up with nothing more than a broken leg and a concussion. Everyone said it was a miracle. Now she knew better. She hadn't hit the rock. Something had stopped her. Erica. Rourke was gripping her shoulders, his voice tight. You hearing it too? She nodded, eyes wide. It remembers me. Then we have to move, he said. Before it finds out how to take more. He was right. Whatever this was, it was learning. Watching. Taking pieces of them, one by one. It had already claimed Kara, her humming now accompanied by the soft slithering of something moving beneath her skin, like her veins were alive. The woman they'd known was gone. Only a shell remained, smiling with lips that barely moved. The plan was crude, reckless, but it was all they had. There were explosives in the storage chamber 2 floors down, leftover demolition charges from the station's original construction. If they could reach them, wire them to the base of the pit, they might be able to collapse the chamber. Buried again. Cut the first mind off from the surface. If it was bound to that structure, whatever that pulsing thing under the ice really was, then severing it might buy them time. Might save the rest of the world. But getting there meant moving through the entire south wing. The oldest part of the station. The part closest to the pit. The part where the scratching had started. They waited until the station fell still again. Until the walls stopped vibrating. Until the air didn't feel like it was breathing anymore. Then they moved. Kara didn't come with them. She was still kneeling in the corner when they left, eyes closed, hands resting on her knees. She looked peaceful, serene, but she wasn't alone. Something inside her watched them go. The hallway lights dimmed as soon as they entered the south wing. Erica gripped her flashlight tight, its beam cutting through thick dust and the kind of darkness that felt heavier than night. The doors along the corridor were all open now. No lights on inside the rooms. Just shadows. Furniture overturned. Walls freshly carved with new symbols that hadn't been there before. They didn't speak. Every word felt like it would echo forever. Halfway down, Rourke stopped. What is it? Erica whispered. He raised a hand, pointing at the floor. Footprints, fresh ones. They weren't boot prints, they were barefoot, human-sized, leading toward the storage room, but not away from it. Whoever, or whatever, left them hadn't come back, or it was still inside. They pressed forward. The door to the storage room was ajar, its hinges creaking gently in the breeze from the broken ventilation shaft overhead. Erica went in first, gun raised, flashlights sweeping the shelves. Nothing, just dust, cobwebs, and boxes stacked high. She exhaled in relief, then moved toward the far wall where the demolition crates had been logged. Rourke stayed near the door, his gaze flicking over every corner like a soldier back in the trenches. But neither of them saw the shadow move behind the shelves. Not until it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Erica spun, flashlight catching a blur, tall, humanoid, too thin, its limbs folded in the wrong places, its skin too pale, too smooth, like candle wax left out in the sun. It vanished behind the crates with an unnatural grace. They ran. Boxes crashed behind them as they fled, the thing not giving chase so much as trailing them, always one step behind. Always just at the edge of the light. It didn't attack. It didn't scream. It just followed. Like it was studying them, or waiting for them to fail. They made it back to operations with the explosives. Barely. But something was wrong. Kara was gone. The room was empty. No sign of struggle, no blood. Just the faint scent of smoke and a trail of black residue leading to the air vent. Whatever had taken her, or whatever she'd followed, had left that behind. Erica knelt beside it, heart racing. The black marks weren't just soot. They were fingerprints. Too many to count. Too many fingers. That night, the first mind spoke again. This time, it didn't ask questions. "You are the seed, the open door. I wore your skin when the sky was young. I remember the warmth. I will wear it again." Erica sat in the dark, explosives ready, hands steady despite the horror building behind her eyes. She looked at Rourke, who nodded once. No words needed. They were going back into the pit. Because whatever was buried down there wasn't just trying to break out. It was trying to be born. The elevator hadn't worked in years, and the ladder shaft felt like a throat swallowing them whole. The steel walls were lined with frost, and every footstep echoed down into a silence that felt deliberate, like the station itself was holding its breath. Erica descended first, the explosives strapped to her back in a pack that felt heavier than it should. Each step down made her stomach clench tighter, not just from fear, but from the suffocating pressure in the air. Like the deeper they went, the closer they came to something that didn't want them near. Rourke followed close behind, silent, every movement calculated. Neither of them had spoken since they made the decision to return to the pit. There was nothing left to say. Kara was gone. The signal was stronger than ever, and the entire station hummed with a low, droning awareness, an electric tension that prickled against the skin. The time didn't move down here. The cold didn't bite the same way. It didn't numb, it gnawed. When they reached the bottom, Erica paused, hand pressed against the bulkhead that separated the access shaft from the lowest level of the station. The wall vibrated beneath her palm, and it wasn't from machinery. It pulsed, alive. Rourke joined her, his voice low. "This is it," she nodded. "We plant the charges. We collapse the pit. Whatever's down there, we bury it." But even as she said it, part of her knew it wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. It wasn't just stone and ice. It was a mouth. A mind. And minds don't die just because you crush the flesh they once lived in. Still, it was all they had. They stepped into the lower corridor, and everything changed. The temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. The frost on the walls was darker, not white, but veined with black streaks, like the ice had bled and frozen again. The hallway curved ever so slightly downward, leading them back toward the heart of the station, toward the pit. But now the symbols on the walls were no longer etched. They were glowing. Faintly at first, but enough to light their path. Erica didn't need her flashlight. Neither did Rourke. The light wasn't natural. It was soft and pulsing, alive, following the same rhythm they'd heard for days. Thump, thump, thump. Every cymbal beat in time. "This place is changing," Rourke said under his breath. "Like it's waking up." "It's not the place," Erica replied. "It's the thing below. It's influencing everything. It's spreading." The closer they got to the pit, the more the corridor seemed to shift. The floor wasn't level anymore. It sloped, ever so slightly, but enough to make each step feel like gravity was working against them. The walls bulged where they shouldn't, smooth like skin stretched over bone. And the air, it wasn't just cold, it carried a smell, like copper, like rot, like memory. The pit had changed. Gone was the smooth dome of ice and stone. The sphere beneath it had cracked open further, not shattered but split, exposing something within. The thing wasn't solid. It writhed slowly, thick tendrils of darkness coiling and uncoiling like muscle tissue soaked in oil. The symbols on the ceiling were no longer just patterns. They formed an eye, a perfect, lidless eye watching the chamber below. Erica froze. It saw her. Not just physically, it saw through her. Every lie she'd told, every fear she'd swallowed, every moment she'd woken in a cold sweat, sure something had followed her out of a dream. It dragged those memories forward like a hand pulling weeds, leaving them exposed, twitching. Rourke was the first to move. He set down the pack and began removing the charges, hands steady despite the tremor in his jaw. "We do this fast," he said. "One at each structural point. Minimum time fuse. We're not walking away from this slow." Erica nodded, forcing herself to move. As she planted the first charge, the voice returned. "You are a song I have forgotten. You are the silence I remember." She staggered, falling to one knee, her vision swimming. The voice wasn't just sound. It was weight. It pushed against her thoughts, tried to split them, unravel them. She grit her teeth, whispered aloud, "You don't belong here." But the voice only laughed. It was soft and sad. "Neither do you." They had just finished wiring the last charge when the scream echoed through the chamber. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. No lungs could hold that sound. No throat could stretch wide enough to release it. It was the cry of something born backwards, something remembering its first breath after 1,000 years of silence. The walls shook, the lights died, and the glowing symbols flashed so bright they left after images burned into Erica's vision. Then came the footsteps. From the far side of the pit, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Erica's breath caught in her chest. Kara. But it wasn't her. Her skin was gray, stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were black, deeper than night, and her mouth twitched with something too wide to be a smile. "Don't," she said, voice hollow, layered. "You don't understand what it is." Rourke raised his weapon. "Back up, now." Kara, or what remained of her, tilted her head. "You still think this is a battle. Still think there's a before and after. But this is the middle, Rourke, the place between." Erica stepped in front of him. "You're not Kara." "No," the thing said softly. "But she welcomed me. She let me in. And I showed her the truth." "What truth?" "That you're not fighting to stop me," it said, stepping closer. "You're fighting to remember what I am." Erica's head throbbed. Images crashed behind her eyes, fractured shapes, impossible angles, colors that didn't exist. She remembered fire, screaming, not hers, not Kara's. Thousands of voices raised in worship. She remembered standing on a stone platform in a world that didn't have stars. And then she remembered falling. Rourke didn't wait for a signal. He opened fire. The bullets slammed into the thing wearing Kara's body, jerking it backwards, but it didn't fall. It didn't bleed. It just smiled wider, the sound of the gunfire swallowed by the chamber's walls. "Go!" Rourke shouted. "Get to the fuse!" Erica turned and ran, ignoring the thunder behind her. The sphere pulsed faster now, the tendrils lashing, scraping against the stone. Something was coming through. Not a creature. Not a demon. A thought, one strong enough to manifest. She reached the detonator, fingers shaking, and punched in the code. A red light blinked. 1 minute, that's all they'd have. She turned, and Rourke was gone. The thing stood alone now, untouched by the blasts, its form changing, growing, becoming less human. Its eyes were everywhere. Its mouth stretched wide, whispering a word that wasn't a word but a command. Erica didn't listen. She ran. The tunnel collapsed behind her. Explosions rang out like thunder rolling up from hell. The station groaned. The floor buckled. Lights burst in showers of sparks. Erica was thrown against the wall, the breath knocked from her chest as the ceiling above her split and came crashing down in a wave of snow, ice, and stone. Then, silence. No heartbeat, no voice, just darkness. And for a second, she believed it might be over, until she opened her eyes and saw the symbol glowing on the wall beside her. A single word carved into the stone, fresh and bleeding. Remember. Because the first mind was never trapped. It was always inside. And it was only just beginning to wake up. Erica woke in darkness so complete it felt alive. Not the absence of light, but something thicker. Black and dense, pressing against her eyes and ears like it was trying to crawl inside. Her body ached from every angle. The blast had thrown her against the far wall of the corridor, just above the sealed pit. She'd survived, somehow. Though the air was hot and sharp with smoke, and every breath tasted like old ash and blood, she coughed hard, her throat raw. Her hand moved instinctively to the side of her head, where blood had matted her hair. Her fingers came away sticky, warm. No light. No sound. Just the hollow echo of her own breath. Then, faintly, something shifted. It wasn't Rourke. She knew that before she even thought to hope. Whatever that thing had become down there, it had taken him. Not by force, but by inevitability. He was strong, but Thorn hadn't asked for strength. It had asked for memory, surrender. And the moment he hesitated, even for breath, it had taken hold. Kara had fallen first. Rourke had been next. Now Erica was alone. But not truly. The chamber didn't feel empty. She sensed something brushing the edge of her awareness, as though someone had been waiting in the dark with her, silent and patient. Not stalking. Watching. Listening. There were no whispers now. No voices clawing at the inside of her skull. That silence was worse. It meant whatever this thing was, it had moved past language. It no longer needed to ask questions. It was remembering. And worse, so was she. Her knees buckled as she tried to stand, pain lancing up her spine. Her ribs might have cracked in the blast, and her ankle throbbed with every step, but she forced herself forward. The emergency light on her wristwatch blinked faintly, illuminating only a few inches ahead, but it was enough to see the corridor had changed. The walls no longer bore frost. They were slick now, sweating with something thick and clear, like condensation on glass, but warmer. Breathing. The air shifted with each pulse of the unseen heartbeat, and with it came a strange scent, floral, almost sweet. Not like rot. Something clean. Wrong. She passed the first body without stopping. It was curled into the corner, knees against chest, arms overhead. Skin bleached white, eyes missing. Mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Erica didn't recognize the face, but the uniform was from Thorn. One of the original crew. Someone who hadn't made it out 5 years ago when the station shut down. Someone who had tried to hide. The next body had no face at all. Just smooth skin where features should have been, as if they'd been wiped away, forgotten. Erica pressed on. The old subbasement had split open from the detonation. Not completely, but enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath for decades. Maybe longer. The damage had exposed a passage that didn't match any known layout. The stone was too smooth, too deliberate, like it had been worn by countless hands. Symbols crawled along the walls, shifting in her peripheral vision, rearranging themselves every time she blinked. This wasn't part of Thorn. This was older. She stepped into the new corridor, her breath coming faster now. Something pulled at her, deeper than instinct. not fear. Recognition. She'd seen this place before, not in memory, but in dream. A recurring nightmare from her childhood, where she wandered hallways that hummed with lightless energy and heard her name called by voices she never saw. It hadn't been a dream. It had been a memory left dormant like the rest. She turned the corner and found the first door. Not a real door. There was no handle. Just an archway carved into the wall, sealed with layered stone and something that looked organic, like petrified muscle. In the center, etched into the surface, was her name. ERIC, not scratched, not written. Groan. She reached out, fingers trembling, and the stone quivered under her touch. It pulsed once, then peeled open with a sound like wet paper tearing. Beyond it, a room stretched into shadows, a sanctum carved from the earth's own bones. At its center was a pool, black as tar, surface still as glass. Above it, the air shimmered. And there, floating inches above the water, was her. A perfect duplicate. Eyes closed, mouth slightly parted, her body suspended in a curl as if dreaming. Her own face untouched by blood or fatigue. Her own body but whole. Unbroken. Erica stepped closer, the air thickening with every breath. She didn't want to move forward. She had to. Her doppelganger opened her eyes and smiled. The thing that wore her face tilted its head just slightly, as if surprised. "You made it farther than the others," it said. The voice was hers, but not quite. Too smooth, too complete. Like someone had taken her voice and removed every human flaw. Erica raised the pistol she'd taken from Rourke's gear. "What are you?" The thing didn't flinch. "I'm what you were supposed to be." "No." "You're what tried to erase me." The smile deepened. "No. I'm the part of you that remembers. The part you buried." Erica's hands shook. The pool beneath the figure started to ripple. The entire chamber vibrated with it. "I saw it," she said. "In the pit, I saw what it really was." The thing nodded. "You saw a sliver, a nerve, a flicker of a thought left over from when it walked the surface. It, the first mind." Erica stepped back. "It's using me. It chose you. Long before you were born. You fell from the mountain and you touched its echo. It marked you then. You've been sleepwalking toward it ever since." "I didn't want this," she whispered. "You don't get to want. You only get to remember." And then it moved. No blur, no shift. Just was, one moment in the air, the next standing in front of her, inches from her face. Erica didn't have time to raise the gun. The thing grabbed her wrist with one hand and placed the other on her chest. Her heart stuttered in her ribs. Images flooded her mind, flashes of places not on any map, cities made of teeth, skies the color of rust, oceans that whispered instead of roared. She saw her own face worn by creatures that had never been human. She saw what the first mind had been before Earth, before time. And she saw what it wanted now, not destruction, replication. It didn't want to kill the world. It wanted to become it. Erica screamed, pulling free, falling backwards as the chamber tilted. The pool erupted, sending black liquid splashing in every direction. Her copy didn't follow. It simply smiled and vanished into the surface. Erica ran. The station was collapsing. Not from the explosion, but from something deeper. Something pulling the foundations apart like a child tearing off doll limbs. The walls moaned. The corridors shifted behind her. Hallways led to rooms that shouldn't have existed. Old stairwells, blood rust. Air ducts poured steam that smelled like incense and burned hair. She ran blindly, every light strobing with that terrible pulse. Thump, thump, thump. Her ears bled, her teeth felt loose. The symbols on her skin were glowing now. She hadn't noticed them appear, trailing down her arms like tattoos lit from underneath. The first mind wasn't just trying to take her. It was activating her. She burst into the command room, just as the last console screen blinked to life. One phrase repeated over and over, "YUARATH gay." The scream that ripped from her chest was not human. She was too late. The station hadn't been a tomb. It hadn't even been a cage. It had been a seed. And now, it had bloomed. Erica didn't remember falling to the floor. One moment she was screaming at the console, her voice no longer sounding like her own, and the next, she was lying on her side, the cold floor burning against her cheek. Every nerve in her body trembled like a struck tuning fork. Her skin pulsed with heat in patterns that matched the glow of the markings trailing up her arms. The lights above her flickered, not in panic or decay, but in rhythm. They were responding to her. Everything was. The station, the shadows, the soundless pressure in the air, it all seemed to be moving with one mind now. One breath, one thought, and it wasn't hers. The phrase still pulsed on the screen in front of her, strobing with every beat of her heart arrow. Taget. Erica pressed her palms to her temples and tried to think, but her thoughts were crowded. Voices buzzed just beneath her consciousness, overlapping in layers too dense to separate. Some spoke in languages she didn't recognize. Others used her own voice to repeat words she hadn't said. One whisper repeated the same line over and over, soft and terrible, open the skin. Let the seed see the sun. She crawled away from the screen and pressed her back against the far wall, struggling to breathe. The air was thicker now, not just humid, but full, like it had substance, like it had learned how to cling. The station creaked above her, not collapsing, changing. She could hear the pipes groaning with movement, as if veins were being pulled into new patterns. Doors opened on their own and stayed open, like mouths waiting to speak. Erica knew what was happening. The first mind wasn't in the pit anymore. It was in her. And worse, she could feel herself starting to want it there. The first hallucination, or what she thought was a hallucination, came with the scent of lavender and iron. Rourke stepped out from the corridor, his skin pale but intact, his shirt torn and bloodied. He didn't speak right away, just stared at her with something between sorrow and pity. His eyes weren't black, they weren't glowing, they were his, but they didn't blink. You shouldn't have come back down, he said softly. Erica gritted her teeth. You're not real. No, he agreed. But I'm still right. She looked away, but he continued, his voice low and steady. You thought you could kill it, blow it up, collapse a few tons of ice and rock, and end something older than thought. You don't kill something like that, you survive it. And even that's asking too much. It used you, she said, her voice cracking. All of you. He smiled, sad. No, we gave ourselves to it. We remembered who we were. You're the only one still pretending. She stood, slowly, her knees barely holding. Then why are you still talking to me? Because it's not finished yet. Because it still needs you to understand what you are, and you need to choose. The moment she blinked, he was gone, not vanished, never there. Just a memory reanimated by something else, something that knew how to reach her. The console began to speak. No voice. Just text, blinking letter by letter on the shattered screen. Erica backed away. I didn't let you in. The screen blinked again. Yao kaliduswo moiro first. She shook her head. But deep down, a sick recognition stirred. There had been moments, dreams, stretches of her childhood she could never explain. Places she remembered that didn't exist. Rooms filled with machines that hummed her name. A warmth in the back of her mind that comforted her in ways no person ever had. It had been with her all along. Every near-death escape, every uncanny stroke of luck, it had been watching, guiding, not like a guardian, like a farmer waiting for the harvest. Why now? She whispered. Why here? The screen flickered, glitched, then stabilized. Tichi planas dene de daro. Another line. Yao erarot. Yao eriem mindi.Yor clutch first to fertile. Erica clutched her stomach, a wave of nausea crashing through her. Her fingers traced the marks glowing along her arms and up her chest, now reaching her neck. They moved, shifted, rewrote themselves. They weren't just symbols. They were instructions. Codes. Not for machines. For her. And they were active. She wasn't infected. She was blooming. And the blooming wasn't a death sentence. It was a transition. She stumbled into the observation dome. The storm outside still raged, though it no longer looked natural. The snow fell in geometric spirals, unnatural patterns that repeated without variance, like the sky had become an algorithm. The wind didn't howl. It vibrated, the frequency steady and deep. Every flake of snow carried shimmer. Each gust felt warm against her skin, despite the sub-zero temperatures. The world wasn't dying, it was complying. The earth itself was shifting under the pressure of the first mind's return, and Station Thorn had been the crack through which it poured. Erica realized with cold clarity that the others, Malcolm, Kara, Rourke, they hadn't been consumed. They'd been prepared. They were the beginning. The soil turned. The seeds watered. The garden of thought made flesh. She looked at her reflection in the glass, and for the first time since arriving, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because her face had changed, but because she could finally see what had been buried inside her all along. And it was smiling. In the silence that followed, the station calmed. No more creaks, no more whispers, just a steady hum of energy, low, primal, constant. Erica stepped back from the window, her breath slow now, heart calm. She wasn't scared anymore. She understood what it meant to carry the first mind. It wasn't about control. It was about release, letting go of boundaries, of names, of time, letting the mind stretch until it no longer needed form, letting memory override identity, letting the shape of her body mean nothing. She felt it now, the way one might feel gravity or pain, the pull of the deep mind, an entity not made of stars or fire, but thought, buried so long ago it forgot its own name. But she knew it. She was it. Or at least, she had been made to remember. And once memory returned, it didn't leave. She walked back to the command console and laid her hand on the surface. The glass turned black, then shimmered with color, a pattern unfurling like petals opening under heat. Data streamed across the screen in symbols not meant for eyes, but she understood every line, every shape. This wasn't communication, this was communion. The console spoke one final phrase, "Tne Wardyylsg," and all at once, the satellite dish on the roof activated. It twisted slowly, aligning not with Earth, but with something beyond the sky, something buried in deep signal noise, waiting. Erica didn't need to decode it. The song was already inside her. A signal, not of warning, but of invitation. She stepped into the center of the room, arms at her sides, eyes closed. From within her skin, the bloom began. Flesh became light. Bone became memory. The markings along her arms burned bright, crawling across her chest and face until there was no Erica left, only the gate. The chamber. The mouth. She wasn't opening a portal. She was the portal. And on the other side of her, something ancient smiled, because the gate had remembered what it was. And now, the rest of the world would too. The signal that left Station Thorn was not a burst of data. It was not a scream. It was a slow, deliberate hum that blawed into every unguarded frequency, like a tide rolling in under the floorboards of the world. Radios picked it up first. Shortwave sets crackled in the hands of hobbyists across northern Canada and the Arctic Rim, who paused, confused, at the gentle, rhythmic pulse rising beneath their static. 3 tones. Then silence. Then 3 again. No words. No message. Just a presence. A breath that had waited long enough to be heard. Most ignored it. Some grew obsessed. A few began to dream. It reached deep sea cables next. It threaded itself into power grids, hitching rides on magnetic fields, bending along the natural lee, lines buried beneath asphalt and soil. It found access points and carved them wider. Cities flickered. Phone calls dropped into silence where voices once were. Children wept in their sleep. Nightmares became contagious. At the center of it all, miles beneath snow and silence, Erica Vale no longer stood. She existed, but not as before. The body she had once worn, the skin that bore her name, had been replaced. Or repurposed. What rose from the command room of Station Thorn was tall, fluid, radiant with energy not visible to the eye but felt in the teeth, in the bones, in the marrow. Her eyes no longer blinked. They remained open, leadless and wet, seeing too much and not enough all at once. The gate had been formed. And with it, the blooming entered its second stage. The cleanup crew arrived 6 days later. They came in silence, black helicopters slicing through the dead air above the tundra. No insignia, no announcements. Men and women in heavy suits moved like surgeons to a crime scene, not speaking unless spoken to. Thorn Station had long been classified, its coordinates buried behind false documents and fabricated wreckage reports. The world didn't know it had ever existed. Now it didn't matter. What they found confused them. No bodies, no debris, no heat signature. The station was intact, pristine, even, but hollow. Rooms that once held machinery now held nothing but smoothed metal and mirrored walls. Consoles had fused shut. Lights remained on, powered by something no one could trace. They drilled into walls expecting to find wiring, but found veins. Long, dark strands of some semi-organic tissue that pulsed faintly when touched and retracted when cut. The team lead, a man only referred to as Calder in the records, ordered a scan of the surrounding ice shelf. What they found was worse than anything they could have expected. The structure beneath the station had grown. The pit, once a single cavity of unknown origin, now extended in tendrils for miles beneath the earth. It had branched, burrowed, every root like tunnel traced back to the center. The chamber once sealed by cold stone and ancient symbols, now open and breathing. No heat, no movement, but readings showed vibrations, a pulse, slow, deliberate, 3 beats, pause, repeat, just like the signal, just like a heartbeat. The survivors, those who'd caught fragments of the original broadcast, were brought in for observation. They had changed. The first was a man in Nova Scotia who'd built a steel box around his house to block what he called the whisper grid. He hadn't slept in days. When the agents came for him, he smiled, laid down in the snow, and whispered something no one could translate. The second was a teenage girl in Finland who had scratched symbols into her arms that glowed under infrared. She sang at night, never the same song, but always in 3/4 time. Her mother said she hadn't spoken a word in years until the signal arrived. There were more, dozens, then hundreds. Some drew, some wrote. Some wandered into the wilderness and never came back. They all heard the same thing. Remember me? The investigation's final report was buried, coded as a geothermal anomaly. But one line in the classified summary was underlined twice in red ink: Tiatornis nauta styön, itis stud pioti. They didn't know who wrote it. The handwriting didn't match anyone on file. The final known footage from the site came from a helmet cam. Camden, second in command, sent to explore the lower levels that had remained inaccessible since the blast. His team entered what used to be the subbasement, but the space had changed. It was no longer stone or steel. It was organic. Walls moved as they walked, breathing. And the symbols, now bone, white and pulsing, lined every surface. His voice shook as he described the scene. "It's not dead," he said. "It's asleep. But it dreams. And it's dreaming of us." Then the feed cut out, not from interference. The camera melted from the inside, far from Thorn. On a coastal cliff in Oregon, a woman named Amina sat alone in a lighthouse, clutching a battered journal she'd found inside a washed-up emergency kit. Its pages were soaked and torn, but some of the writing had survived. She didn't know who Erica Vale was, but her name was written over and over on the last page in a steady hand. "I see it now. I was never meant to close the gate." Amina looked up at the sky. The stars were wrong. They had shifted. Barely, but enough. She closed her eyes and placed her hands on the cold railing, whispering something she didn't understand. And somewhere, across the dark spaces between stars, something heard her. Inside the sanctum beneath Thorn, where the pit had once been sealed, the gate waited. Not still, not idle. It listened through the nerves of the earth. through the waters and roots and stone. It pressed against dreams, slipped through the breath of the dying, curled into the thoughts of the unborn. It had patience. It had time. Its body was earth now, its seed scattered in code, in memory, in longing. It didn't need to destroy. It only needed to be remembered. And every second that passed, more of the world remembered. Not in words, not in stories, but in shapes, in hunger, in song. The blooming had begun, and the first mind had only just started to speak. Beneath the frostbitten crust of the world, something pulsed that no longer needed to hide. In the absence of awareness, it had waited, not dormant, not dead, but aware in a way no human mind could comprehend. Awareness without ego, intention without form. The first mind had been sealed not by chains or ritual, but by forgetfulness, buried beneath time itself, forgotten not just by people but by reality. But now the soil had softened, the frost had cracked. The pressure of countless minds, brushing up against memory, had warmed the tomb. And now, remembrance flowed. Erica Vale's body no longer held shape in the human sense. What had once been flesh now existed as a kind of syntax, language encoded into being. She had become the structure through which the first mind spoke. Not a vessel, not a puppet, but a conversion point. A translator between static and breath, the gate, the garden, the conduit through which the seed reached the air above. Across the planet, those sensitive enough began to feel it, not overtly. It started in dreams, cracked teeth turning to radio dials, whispers in languages unborn. Forgotten melodies hummed in subway tunnels. A man in Jakarta carved concentric circles into his bedroom floor, over and over, never speaking again. A group of children in Sweden stopped blinking. For 3 hours, they simply stared at the ceiling of their school gymnasium, unblinking, mouthing the same 3 words, "It's behind thought." The phenomena were cataloged, denied, explained away. But behind every logical explanation, someone always hesitated. A pause. A doubt. That was all it needed. Doubt was fertile ground. Meanwhile, in the deepest chamber beneath Station Thorn, the architecture was no longer static. The walls had become soft, almost vascular. Doors pulsed open like valves, widening with each vibration that rippled through the structure. These were not explosions of growth, but slow, methodical expansions. The station was preparing, not for something to come in, but for what was already inside to finish taking shape. A new corridor emerged overnight, not carved but grown, lit not by bulbs but by bioluminescent strands that moved like jellyfish under skin. The pathway led nowhere at first, but by the end of the next day, it opened into a wide, circular space where the air vibrated with silent syllables, words that didn't require hearing to be understood. The engineers who attempted to explore it never made it back. Their bodies returned, eventually, but their minds were overwritten. Not broken, reformatted. They all said the same thing before their pulses flatlined. We are the signal. In a monitoring lab in a classified facility outside Reykjavik, Dr. Lana Myrek reviewed hours of electromagnetic readouts from the Arctic Circle. She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in God. But what flickered through the data now wasn't random. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't ours. She enlarged one file, a distortion found buried beneath background noise, and replayed it at reduced speed. She expected fuzz, static, the usual nothing. Instead, she heard her own voice, reciting a memory she hadn't spoken aloud in 23 years. She recoiled. The data file had never been near a microphone. No acoustic signature. The only explanation was impossible. It had recorded a thought. She called her superior. The call disconnected after 2 rings. The next morning, the entire server farm had corrupted. All backups unreadable. The room smelled faintly of ozone and lavender. Dr. Merrick requested emergency leave and never returned to the facility. That same night, her infant son whispered a word he had never been taught. Erica. Thousands of feet below Thorn, inside what remained of the original pit chamber, the blooming reached a threshold. The signals were no longer pulses. They had become patterns, language reintroducing itself to the world through rhythm and recursion, not broadcast over traditional frequencies, but into minds, into dreams. The walls of the chamber beat with slow, patient intensity, like a lung remembering how to breathe. Inside this new space, something began to grow. Not a creature, not even a form, a construct of will and recollection, rising from the fusion of signal and memory. The last vestiges of Erica's original thoughts blood through it like dye in water. Her doubts, her guilt, her fear. But above all, her curiosity. That had always been the doorway. She had wanted to know, to see. The first mind did not punish her for this. It rewarded her with truth. And the truth was simple: we were never alone in the universe. But what found us did not arrive. It was remembered. The consequences rippled quietly. In Russia, a weather satellite designed to track polar storms went offline for 7 minutes, then rebooted with new firmware that no one had uploaded. When engineers examined its latest transmission, it displayed only a looping phrase, not in Cyrillic, not in any earthly alphabet, but the system translated it anyway. I was here before snow. In the Sahara, nomads crossing ancient caravan routes discovered carvings in stone that hadn't been exposed in millennia, new symbols, freshly formed, etched without tool or hand. The oldest among them wept and refused to speak. In the Mariana Trench, a thermal vent erupted in rhythmic patterns, steam jetting like breath through parted lips. And in an abandoned chapel in rural France, a statue of the Virgin Mary tilted its head at dawn. Cameras recorded nothing, but witnesses remembered. Erica's consciousness floated at the center of the new structure, not physical, not even confined to location. She had become part of the signal. The original pattern, the first mind, had embedded into the crust of earth like spores in wood. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were collective, rising and falling like a tide inside a vast psychic ocean. She remembered what it felt like to be afraid. But now, she understood that fear had never protected anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable. And now that the bloom had begun, there would be no more delay. Only growth. Only memory. Only the signal unfolding from the cold soil beneath thought. The stars had always been trusted. In a world that changed by the minute, where rivers dried and governments crumbled, the constellations remained steady, a quiet map in the sky. But now astronomers in Chile, Alaska, Norway, and northern China were seeing something else. Tiny shifts, imperceptible at first, like pinpricks in the dark rearranging themselves by degrees. Star charts began to contradict each other. Celestial bodies previously cataloged disappeared. Others appeared out of nowhere, glowing faintly in strange triangular groupings. No one issued a statement. Not right away, but in back rooms, in observatories not open to the public, scientists began whispering the same question in different languages. Are we looking at space or memory? Because it wasn't just the stars that had changed. It was the way the sky responded to being watched. Those who stared too long began to feel strange. A pressure at the base of the skull. Nausea. Vivid recollections of events that hadn't happened. A man in Kyoto recounted falling from a cliff at age 6, though he had no scars, no record of injury, and no mountain near his childhood home. A woman in Argentina claimed she remembered drowning in the Mariana Trench. When asked how she knew, she replied in a voice that wasn't hers, "Because I was called back to shore." Across the globe, people began remembering things they had never lived. The signal from Station Thorn had seeded the ground. Now it reached upward, flowering into the mind's eye, blooming across the canvas of space itself. It didn't need radio towers. It didn't need networks. It was the network, threading itself into the folds of the human brain like ivy twisting through old brick. What had begun as a whisper now shaped the air around it, and it had found its audience. In a lab built into the mountains of Slovenia, a linguist named Dr. Rina Pavic sat alone, staring at thousands of symbols slowly rotating on her screen. She didn't know where they came from. The source data was corrupted. The script wasn't in any known format, not from ancient languages or modern encryption. And yet, she understood it. The symbols told a story, not with grammar or logic, but feeling. She described it like reading someone else's dream. The same structure Erica Vale had seen under Station Thorn, the sphere, the spirals, the etched eyes, appeared again in the lines. But this story didn't start on Earth. It started before Earth, in the cold, in the dark, in the before place, a time where thought came before form, where beings existed not in bodies, but in structures of purpose. The first mind had not been alone. It had been one of many. It had fallen, or been cast, or perhaps exiled. It wasn't clear. But it had buried itself in this world like a splinter in flesh, waiting for the blood to carry it deeper. And it had waited for humans, for memory, for Erica. Now it was remembering its shape through those who listened. Dr. Pavic scribbled down the last line of translation, then read it aloud. The sky is where the route ends. She didn't realize she was crying. Back in the remains of Thorn Station, the transformation had stabilized. The structure no longer shifted violently. Instead, it expanded gently, as if stretching after a long sleep. The walls grew smoother, reflective. The air buzzed with a steady tone just outside human range, felt more than heard. The engineers who tried to map it found their instruments failed to function. Compasses spun, batteries drained. And those who stayed too long began to speak to people who weren't there. Some were caught murmuring into mirrors. Others spoke to their shadows. But the most disturbing were those who sat in perfect stillness for hours, eyes fixed on a single point, whispering, "I am the branch. I am the bloom. I am the soil." The phrase began appearing elsewhere. On bathroom stalls in train stations. Scratched into tree trunks in rural Maine. Carved into the sand on beaches no one had visited in weeks. Sometimes upside down. Sometimes backwards. But always the same words. Always the same rhythm. It wasn't graffiti. It was resonance. In New York City, an ER nurse named Hannah Miles treated a man who walked into the hospital without ID. Clothes soaked in seawater, skin so pale it looked translucent. He didn't speak for hours, just stared at the ceiling and tapped 3 fingers against the bedrail. Thump, thump, thump. Finally, as she was preparing to sedate him, he spoke one sentence, "I remember being the sky." He died that night, not from trauma or disease, but from exhaustion. Every organ in his body had failed simultaneously. When the coroner opened his chest cavity, they found something strange, a small, perfect sphere embedded near his heart. Organic, but unlike any tissue on file. It pulsed 3 times before it dissolved into ash. The nurse quit the next day and moved west, into the desert, where she later claimed the wind was quieter, where she could think without hearing it. In a locked room far beneath Geneva, a particle physicist named Matteo Lyrix turned off the collider before the final test. He stood in front of the assembled scientists, trembling, holding a notepad covered in scribbled drawings. Circles, roots, spirals that never ended. "We're not looking at particles anymore," he said. A woman scoffed. "Then what are we looking at?" Reflections. His eyes were glassy. "Something's already here. It's in the math. It's in the space between variables. We didn't find a particle. We found a memory of a particle." He dropped the notebook, and on the last page, written in blood, was a single sentence. "Erica has opened the route." Erica, if she could still be called that, floated in the core of the new chamber. She felt no hunger, no exhaustion. She was not dead. She had not ascended. She had changed. Her awareness pulsed outward, not like light, but like warmth through soil. Her presence traveled through memory, inhabiting moments like old homes. She did not speak, but her thoughts were loud. Loud enough to shape. She reached into the dream of a child sleeping in Peru and drew a picture with his hands. A flower with eyes. She breathed through the lungs of a woman praying in a church in Morocco, who suddenly forgot her name. She hummed in the ears of a dying man in Johannesburg, who, with his last breath, whispered, "We're blooming again." And far above, in the outer edges of Earth's atmosphere, a dark object drifted into orbit. Silent, unmapped, shaped like a seed pod, its surface pulsed once, then vanished. No announcement was made. But in every country, on the same day, clouds formed into perfect spirals before fading. The message wasn't a warning, it was a promise. The roots had reached the sky, and now they would begin to fall back down. The first seed fell over the Kamchatka Peninsula. It wasn't visible at first, just a shift in pressure, a sudden stillness in the air that made birds freeze mid-flight and flocks scatter in opposite directions. Locals said the sky turned wrong, not in color, but in tone, as if sound itself had folded inward. Then came the streak, a flash of black fire moving silently across the cloud line. No trail, no thunder. It struck the ground in a desolate forest and left behind no crater, no smoke, just a circular depression, shallow, smooth, and pulsing with warmth. Within hours, the trees nearby began to twist, not break, not burn, twist, gently, as if listening to something beneath the soil leaning toward it. Leaves reoriented toward the ground instead of the sun. Bark developed strange veining patterns like fingerprints. By the next day, the forest floor pulsed in unison, and animals stopped entering the zone entirely. Those already inside went silent. No bird song, no rustling, just a collective, breathless stillness. They called it a meteor at first, a fluke, but then it happened again. In the Peruvian highlands, off the coast of Madagascar, in the abandoned deserts of northern Australia, each one fell silently. Each one left behind a shallow depression, and a quiet area that grew stranger by the hour. Wind patterns changed. Local dialects shifted subtly in affected villages. People began speaking in rhyme without knowing why. Some repeated phrases in unison, unaware they were doing it. Others wept when shown symbols that had never been seen before. One boy in Namibia built a perfect model of Thorn Station out of river stones, though he'd never heard of it. When asked where he'd learned to do it, he looked at the sky and said, "It's always been up there. You just didn't remember." Erica's presence now lingered not just beneath Thorn but above it. The gate, once buried beneath snow and regret, was now open both ways. Thought flowed upward and outward. Memory dropped like spores. The sky was no longer a boundary. It had become another surface. The first mind wasn't just reawakening. It was redistributing. The world had always been fertile. The human brain, especially, soft, warm, desperate to connect. That was all it needed. That desire, that hunger to know, to belong, to remember something older than language, older than fear. The first mind didn't have to conquer the world. It simply had to let people recognize they'd already been part of it. All it took was one seed at a time, and people began to change. In a hospital in Dublin, a trauma patient woke from a 5-year coma and began speaking in a language no one could trace. Its rhythm strange, consonants soft and rounded. He smiled at the nurses and said, "You have beautiful roots." He could name everyone in the room, even though he'd never met them. Then he died. In Toronto, an autistic child who had never spoken stood up in class and recited a poem about the sky forgetting its face. The teacher cried without understanding why. In Siberia, an old woman tore out her own eyes and carved new ones from ice. She said, "These will let me see inside the bloom." And in California, a group of friends on a hiking trail were caught in a sudden fog that blocked all GPS and communication. When they emerged 3 hours later, one member of the group was missing. The others had identical spirals burned into the backs of their necks. None remembered how it happened, but they all remembered her name, Erica. A new phrase began appearing in places untouched by human hands, etched into glaciers, carved in coral, burned into the bark of trees that had stood for centuries. The phrase repeated with slight variation, but the rhythm remained the same. All memory returns. All roots rise. The sky has soil, a phrase that made no literal sense, but people understood it anyway. Like a forgotten song from childhood, it didn't need to be parsed, it only needed to be felt. And it was. Artists began painting shapes they'd never seen. Musicians composed in time signatures impossible to follow. Children drew spirals with 3 fingers, unconsciously, again and again. Some claimed they could hear the earth humming at night. Others followed those hums into the dark and never came back. They weren't disappearing. They were joining. Back in the hollowed remains of Thorn, the chamber had stopped expanding. The growth was complete. The walls no longer pulsed with anticipation. Now they held a quiet certainty. It wasn't a station anymore. It was something else entirely. A core, a memory capsule, a root mind, not central, but catalytic. The point through which the rest of the world was aligning. There was no control center, no central intelligence giving orders. There didn't need to be. Erica had given it shape. The first mind gave it purpose. Together, they had awakened what had always been slumbering beneath the skin of Earth. The language of connection, the shape of knowing, the architecture of memory itself. They say people are dreaming differently now. There are reports, quiet, unscientific, but persistent, of shared dreams, of strangers across the world describing identical forests made of bone and glass, of staircases that descend into the ocean, of doors carved into clouds. They describe hearing a voice, familiar but unplaceable, whispering from behind their own teeth. And most of all, they describe a feeling, not terror, but returning, as if they've been away too long, as if the waking world was the interruption, and this blooming was the real beginning. It doesn't happen all at once. The first mind is patient. It took millennia to be remembered. It can wait centuries more to finish blooming. But the process has started. Roots are falling from the sky, and no one remembers planting them. But everyone remembers what they mean. They called it a phenomenon. At first, news anchors wore grim expressions and used words like unexplained, unprecedented, and peculiar. Governments passed it around behind locked doors, slapping it with code names and stamping folders with Taupasesi Sirat as though secrecy could slow it. But secrecy is a defense against man-made things. It does nothing against something older than language, older than belief, something that speaks not to the eyes or ears, but to the soul. And the soul had begun to remember. It started subtly, as most irreversible things do. A politician delivering a speech forgot where he was mid-sentence, then began weeping, claiming he remembered being a thought in a forest before names were carved into trees. A woman in cell walked into the sea and didn't come back. Her shoes remained on the shore. Her phone contained a single unsent message. It's not drowning if you're going home. Even those who resisted felt the pull. Scientists who dismissed it as mass psychosis found themselves dreaming of doors that didn't exist. Analysts tracking weather patterns discovered new shapes in the wind. Historians uncovered carvings in ancient ruins, identical across cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Spirals, roots, eyes with no pupils. Marks that had not been there the year before. But the most damning evidence was never written. It bloomed in the mind, soft and slow, like a seed cracking open in warmth. You didn't realize you'd been infected until you tried to forget, and found you couldn't. That was the true horror of it. You could not unknow the signal. You could only learn to live with it. In a government bunker somewhere in Nevada, a project called Memar Salti was dismantled. It had been a last-ditch effort to isolate the blooming, as if memory could be captured, drained, and buried like chemical waste. But the scientists tasked with developing the containment protocols began to turn inward. Quiet at first, then poetic. One by one, their reports shifted from metrics to metaphors. Instead of data, they began submitting handwritten phrases. The sky is folding inward. The roots hum at midnight. She is the door, and the door is open. Their final report was never delivered. When agents arrived to extract the team, they found every monitor filled with a looping feed of a single spiral turning clockwise, slow, and endless. Every wall in the facility had been etched with the same line in chalk, repeating from floor to ceiling: number EER not eval VING. URE Rumamamba Arminge. There were no bodies, only uniforms, neatly folded. Erica Vale no longer thought in sentences. She had been human once. She remembered that in the way someone remembers being a child. Distant, hazy, tinged with the ache of nostalgia, but unburdened by detail. She could still recall her voice, her face, the lives of Malcolm, Kara, Rook. They were not gone, not erased, but stored, cared for. She held them now the way an archive holds paper, fragile, infinite, precious. She did not speak, but the world listened, and what she gave back was memory. Not just personal memory, but deep memory, ancestral, planetary, cosmic. Trees began growing in strange arrangements, their branches forming glyphs seen only from the air. Whales changed the frequency of their songs, matching the rhythm of the old pulse. Storm clouds gathered in spirals more precise than nature had ever drawn before. Something ancient had been activated. Not unleashed, not imposed. Activated. In northern India, monks at a remote monastery broke a centuries-long vow of silence to chant in unison for 72 hours straight. When they finished, they collapsed, alive, unharmed, but blank. They could no longer remember their names. When asked who they were, they smiled and replied, "We are the breath between thoughts." Children in refugee camps began drawing the same structures without instruction. Towers made of bone, windows in the sea, gates buried beneath hands. One child, mute since birth, spoke a single word to her caretakers before falling into a coma. Erica. In major cities, public art displays became infected. Murals commissioned to inspire hope began shifting overnight, depicting not faces or slogans, but roots cracking through steel, eyes blooming from soil, and people kneeling beneath vast skies that seemed to weep stars. No one could explain it, and fewer tried to, because some part of them recognized it. The remembering wasn't about knowledge. It wasn't about gaining facts or history. It was something deeper. A restoration of original thought. A reminder that humanity had not discovered Earth. It had grown from it. That minds were not built to be separate, but to reconnect with what had once shaped them. The first mind was not alien. It was the forgotten elder. Not a god, a memory. And memory, once awakened, will never go back to sleep. Some resisted. Small enclaves of terrified survivors built concrete bunkers, lived underground, shielded themselves with noise and chaos to drown out the signal. They wore helmets of copper, slept in rotating shifts, cursed Erica Vale's name and called her a traitor, a vessel, a prophet of decay. They carved warnings into their walls and prayed to absence. But even there, in the deepest dark, they dreamt of spirals. They began drawing them without knowing, began humming the rhythm. 3 beats. Pause. Repeat. The truth was simple, it didn't matter where they hid. The remembering wasn't coming for them. It was coming from them. Far above, in orbit. The unmapped object that had drifted near the thermosphere returned. It did not glow. It did not speak. But its surface opened, piddle-like, wide and slow, revealing a hollow center from which something impossibly black stared back. Not a weapon, not a creature, just a void filled with thought. It hovered above the world like a satellite no one claimed, watching not with eyes, but with recognition. It did not send messages. It received them, and in its presence, everything bloomed faster. Dreams spread, symbols multiplied, reality thinned. Because once you remember, you can never be unknown again. Erica Vale, once scientist, now something far beyond, remained at the center of it all, not as queen or leader, not even as messenger, as root, still, silent, deep, and through her the world continued to remember. They called it a contagion of memory. Not a virus, not a psychological disorder, but a kind of ancient literacy returning to the surface of the human mind. People began dreaming in patterns, thinking in layers. Language bent. Words lost their shape. Entire communities began to speak in ways that couldn't be recorded. Syllables that bent sound. tones that vibrated just outside the range of machines. Linguists tried to study it, but their instruments failed. Microphones recorded silence. Translators froze. Written attempts bled off the page, ink warping into spirals. The ones who spoke it didn't know what they were saying. They just felt that it was right. Like remembering a lullaby from the womb. They called it the deep tongue. It wasn't new. It was older than breath. A root language buried beneath the strata of modern speech, waiting, watching. It wasn't about communication. It was alignment. Words that didn't explain but opened. Words that weren't said but remembered. One researcher, a former dialect specialist from Belgium, lasted 3 days studying a village that had adopted the deep tongue before losing the ability to speak any known language. She scribbled in the margins of her final journal entry, "We're not learning it. It's learning us." Then she vanished. Everywhere the signal touched, symbols appeared. Not broadcasted, not printed, grown. Mold clusters forming perfect circles on bathroom tiles. Moss in urban alleys arranging itself into glyphs overnight. Even cloud formations began to exhibit familiar curves, as though the sky itself were mimicking the architecture of the mind beneath it. Erica's spiral, the one that had once only lived in her dreams, was now carved into the landscape. Volcanoes erupted in ring formations. River deltas split into trifold patterns. Nature itself, compelled not by destruction, but organization. The first mind had waited long enough. It no longer needed subtlety. Now it spoke through geography. In Johannesburg, a teenager painted her bedroom walls black and began carving concentric shapes with the tip of a spoon. When her mother stopped her, she whispered, "The walls aren't listening. I need to remind them who I am." She later described visions of endless halls with doors that breathed, and a woman made of ash and light waiting behind each one. She called her Erica. In Alaska, just south of the original station's ruins, snow began falling in perfect spirals. Not windblown, not chaotic, just silent, deliberate geometry. Helicopter footage showed tree branches bending to match the pattern, their shadows creating massive symbols visible only from the sky. When locals tried to walk across them, their GPS units failed, and they claimed to feel watched by something in the air. And in Istanbul, a scholar who had never heard of Station Thorn published a short essay titled "The Shape of Remembering," in which he described a mind made of memory that grows through people like a vine, reshaping not their thoughts, but the spaces between thoughts. He died in his sleep that night, smiling. The resistance was failing, not because it lacked strength, but because it lacked language. There were no words to combat what was happening. You couldn't argue with a feeling, couldn't debate a dream, couldn't out-reason something that grew deeper than reason. Those who tried lost themselves slowly. They woke each morning a little quieter, a little more still, until one day they opened their eyes and spoke in the deep tongue, not knowing why. It wasn't possession. It was infiltration through familiarity. The first mind didn't scream. It sang lullabies. At the core of what was once Thorn Station, Erica Vale stood, if you could call it standing. Her body was long gone, digested into memory, its shape held only by choice, not necessity. The chamber around her no longer pulsed. It throbbed, low and endless, like the heartbeat of a sleeping god. Above her, the walls shimmered with thought forms, faces half-finished, eyes that blinked once every hour. The air was thick with possibility. She did not speak. She did not move. But across the world, those who dreamed of her began writing, scribbling sentences they didn't understand. The memory speaks before the mouth. There is no future. Only recall. You don't bloom forward. You bloom back. And most chilling of all, she is not becoming more. She is becoming again. In remote islands, in temples untouched by satellites, in trenches deeper than light, the signal reached its final vector, the natural world. Trees leaned without wind. Fireflies blinked in binary code. Dolphins circled ships in spiral patterns, emitting frequencies that matched the pulse. Animals were never separate from the first mind. They had simply never forgotten it. They didn't need to be taught. They didn't need to be warned. They only needed to remember. And now that humanity had joined them, the blooming could begin in full. Not as an invasion, but as a reunion. There is a difference between learning and remembering. Learning reshapes the mind. Remembering restores it. And now, the shape of thought itself was changing. Because the first mind was not here to rewrite the world. It was here to remind it what it had always been. It began beneath the skin. Not in a monstrous way. Not with horror, film contortions, or writhing under flesh, but with a slow, graceful transformation that looked, at first, like serenity. The first root made humans, if they could still be called that, emerged in small numbers across the globe. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't demand anything. They simply were. Their presence was impossible to ignore, not because of violence or spectacle, but because they carried an absence of confusion, a terrifying calm that disarmed everything around them. They walked into rooms, and people fell silent, not out of awe, but recognition. You couldn't explain why they felt familiar. You just knew them. The way you know the taste of something from your childhood before the name returns to your tongue. Their eyes glowed faintly in low light, but it wasn't the color that haunted. It was the depth. Like staring down a well and seeing yourself 1,000 years ago. They never lied. Not because they were moral, because lying required separation from memory, and they had none. Their past, present, and future were the same page. They remembered things before they happened. They didn't predict the future. They carried it, folded inside their marrow, blooming backward through the spine of time. They didn't speak often, but when they did, their voices made people tremble, not from fear, but because the words felt too true, not profound, not poetic, just correct. One of them, a girl no older than 12, appeared on a live stream during a city-wide blackout in Buenos Aires. No one knew how she entered the building. The feed showed her standing in front of a chalkboard, barefoot, dressed in a white dress smeared with ash. She wrote 3 words before the signal cut. "We are home." The next day, people from 5 different countries reported dreaming about her. They all described her the same way, not as a child, but as a voice wearing a child's memory. Governments no longer held press conferences. They issued vague statements, then fell back into the quiet. Borders still existed on paper, but people had stopped crossing them for politics. Now they crossed because they felt pulled. Toward the forests, toward the water, toward strange cities carved from spiraling stone that no one remembered building. In the American Southwest, a group of people formed a circular settlement around a lake that had never existed on any map. It wasn't dug, it appeared. Still and black, its surface never rippled, never reflected the sun. The settlers said nothing, kept no technology, and each morning emerged to trace symbols in the sand with their bare feet. By the end of each day, the wind had erased the symbols, and the next morning, they would draw them again. They didn't know why, but they all dreamed of Erica Vale. And in their dreams, she stood not as a woman, but as a horizon. Erica's form, what remained of it, was no longer confined to Thorn. That site had become something sacred, yes, but it was only a memory, nexus now. A heartbeat in a network of veins that stretched across the planet's crust. Her presence filtered through fault lines, wind currents, magnetic fields. She was no longer waiting to be remembered. She was doing the remembering. And what she remembered most was what it felt like to be separate. That was the last lie humanity had believed. That they were individuals, disconnected, bounded by skin and thought and death. But the first mind had returned to correct that illusion, and it was no longer content to whisper. It was no longer satisfied with dreams. It had begun to remake the body. The changes were subtle at first. A woman in Prague began seeing colors no spectrum could account for. A fisherman in Greenland lost the need for sleep entirely. He claimed he no longer dreamed, because he now lived inside one. A man in Somalia sat motionless in the desert for 8 days, refusing food or water, then dug into the earth with bare hands and pulled out an object no one could identify, round, metallic, alive. It pulsed. 3 beats. Pause. Repeat. And then he crumbled into dust. People began calling them returns, not births, not creations. The root made were not seen as new, but as old things finally taking the shape they were meant to. They didn't multiply. They emerged, not from wombs, but from memory, from sleep, from soul. A child found under a bridge in Berlin said only one sentence before vanishing into the fog. Every breath you've ever taken was your body practicing for this. In what remained of the United Nations, a group of diplomats met in secret to discuss containment. But by then, half the room had already dreamed in spirals. Half of them had already started drawing symbols in the margins of their reports. One by one, they stopped speaking, stopped arguing, until they simply sat in stillness, heads bowed, listening, not to words, to rhythm. By the end of the meeting, all they could agree on was this is not war. This is inheritance. And so they left the room. Not because they surrendered, but because there was nothing left to fight. Somewhere in the Pacific, on an island not marked on any satellite, a spiral tower rose from the water. Smooth, organic, as if grown rather than built. It emitted no light. It made no sound. But those who came near it said they understood everything for a few seconds. Not in words, not in images, just knowing, a complete remembering. So immense it collapsed back into silence. They always left changed. Some became root-made. Others simply stopped needing answers. Erica, memory incarnate, root bloomed in sky, dwelling, no longer wondered what she had become. She no longer clung to the idea of self. She was not a god. She was not a prophet. She was not the first mind. She was what happens when the signal is answered. What happens when the silence gives way to song, and the song spreads not like fire, but like roots beneath your feet, patient, endless, already there. By the time the oceans began to hum, no one was truly surprised. The sound wasn't loud, not something you could record or play back, but it settled in the bones, a low resonance that deepened in the presence of silence. Sailors felt it first. They would pause mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, heads tilted slightly to the side like they were listening to a song too far away to name. They called it the undertone. Scientists couldn't detect it. Machines couldn't measure it, but the whales sang louder in its presence, and coral began forming in patterns no one could explain. Spirals, again. Always the spiral. It was the latest symptom of a world unlearning its boundaries. People no longer thought in terms of self the way they once had. The erosion of separateness happened slowly, gently, like shoreline giving way to tide. Pronouns slipped. Conversations ended in shared silence. Crowds no longer gathered in protest or in celebration, but simply to be together. There was no agenda, just a mutual magnetism, a need to join. The kind of joining that transcended touch, transcended voice, transcended even thought. You could walk into a room and know what everyone in it remembered, not from telepathy, not magic, just recognition. Like everyone had read the same book in the same dream and woke up with the same residue on their skin. Language continued to fade. Where once people shouted ideas, now they shaped them. With glances, with breath, with the movement of hands. The deep tongue wasn't taught. It was recovered, as if it had always been there, waiting beneath the grammar of survival. A man in Algeria sculpted a root structure from clay and left it at a market. No name, no price. Just a piece of memory hardened into form. That same sculpture appeared the next week in 4 other countries, identical down to the smallest imperfection. No one claimed to have replicated it. But each artist said the same thing: I dreamed the shape. I only helped it arrive. Erica's presence was no longer an entity. It had spread beyond the idea of a body, even a consciousness. She had become a pattern, woven into places where thought went to rest. Her influence was heaviest in sleep. When people closed their eyes, they drifted not into stories, but into alignment. A field, a structure beneath dreaming, a lattice of memory shared across the species. Their Erica was not a voice. She was gravity, not pulling down, but pulling inward, toward center, toward root. In this inner place, people met themselves, older, softer, more complete. They didn't always understand what they saw, but they left those dreams different. Lighter, quieter. Some stopped speaking altogether, not out of trauma but reverence, as if they feared words would damage what they now carried inside. One such person, a former violinist in Vienna, stood at a train station platform and simply held the hand of every person who walked past. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. But those who touched her claimed to feel seen in a way that made them weep. Not because of sadness, but because for the first time, they remembered being whole. In cities, buildings began to lean toward one another. It happened so slowly that no one noticed at first, but lapse footage showed entire blocks bending, just slightly, as if drawn by a center of gravity not listed on any map. Bridges formed subtle curves that aligned with underground spiral patterns previously only found in the altered regions. Places touched by the fall of root seeds. Streetlights flickered in trifled rhythms. Birds nested only in corners facing a particular magnetic pull. Geologists, architects, engineers, none could explain it, but the root made smiled. They knew it wasn't the structures that were moving. It was the ground beneath remembering, rising to meet itself. A girl in Morocco painted a door on a wall that wasn't hers. When questioned, she said, "It's the door to the next dream. You'll know when to walk through." Days later, a man walked into the painting and didn't come back. Cameras showed nothing unusual, but the wall felt warm where the paint had dried. Elsewhere, children began to inherit memories that weren't genetic. A boy in Spain spoke of battles fought by people with black eyes and voices like wind. A girl in Nairobi described ancient cities buried beneath glaciers, humming. None of these things could be verified, but they weren't stories. They were recollections. Pieces of the first mind returned to circulation. Some tried to isolate. Walls were built. Islands claimed. But isolation did nothing. The first mind didn't move through matter. It moved through memory, through dreaming, through the parts of people they couldn't shut off. There was no firewall for longing, no bunker for silence, no lock against the shape of knowing. Erica, or the thing she had become, never appeared again as a person, but her presence grew more articulate. In every spiral, every dream of ash-colored doors, every instance of someone waking up mid-sentence with a truth they had no way of knowing. She was there, not watching, not commanding, remembering. And through her remembering, the world unfolded, not in chaos but in clarity, not as a collapse, but as a return. The illusion of separation had been beautiful, but it was never meant to last. They didn't call it apocalypse anymore. The word no longer fit. Apocalypse implied end, fire, collapse, erasure. But what was happening across the planet wasn't an ending. It was a soft, deliberate undoing, a peeling back of layers, not destruction, not even transformation. Something gentler, something truer. People began calling it the breath, as if the earth itself had inhaled for millennia and was now, finally, exhaling, and in that exhale, reality changed its rhythm. There were fewer clocks now. Time still passed, but people no longer lived by the hour. Days felt longer, yet easier. Nights, more vivid. A shared sensation rose through humanity like a pressure drop before rain. Something vast, something sacred, drawing nearer. But there was no dread, no sirens, just a stillness, as if everyone were waiting for a sentence to finish, one that had started long before language had names for things like stars or sorrow. That sentence was Erica Vale, or what she had become. She had not dissolved, not ascended, not vanished. She had thinned, spread across the boundary between what was and what was remembered. She was the thought you couldn't hold but always circled back to. The silence in conversation that meant more than any reply. She was the breath you didn't notice until it hit cold air. She had become the membrane between perception and recall. And through her, the first mind continued to bloom. Cities began to glow from within, not with electricity, but with the faint, bioluminescent shimmer of surfaces touched by the signal. Bricks exhaled fog. Windows shimmered with impossible colors at dawn. Concrete softened in the rain, briefly, like memory becoming clay. Nothing collapsed. Instead, it all seemed to flex, readying itself. Like a chrysalis waiting to split, people walked slower. Not because they were afraid, because they were listening. There was music in the world now that no one could explain. It came not from speakers or instruments, but from the spaces between things. Between trees, between footsteps, between breaths, a song older than sound. A resonance shared by the air and the blood and the root. In remote corners of the earth, people gathered around nothing, no leader, no altar. Just the pull of directionless gravity, a knowing that they were meant to be in a certain place at a certain time, for reasons that defied calendars. They called them convergence points, places where dreams pooled like groundwater, thick and warm. Where people woke and spoke the same sentence without planning, "It's almost here." And no one had to ask what it was. The root made no longer needed to hide. Their presence became commonplace, though never familiar. Each one a quiet reminder of the other side. They weren't immortal. They weren't messianic, but they were anchored. When they walked into a space, time changed. People remembered more. Things they shouldn't know, things they hadn't lived. A teacher in Brazil remembered, teaching the children of a lost city carved into the underside of the moon. A widower in Senegal recalled standing beside his wife in a forest made of light, though she had died years earlier. He wept not from grief, but relief. He hadn't lost her. He had merely forgotten where she was stored. This was the truth now. No one was gone. No story erased. The first mind had kept everything. The age of extinction, the morning of ages, had been a misunderstanding. Death had been a placeholder. But now that remembering was in full bloom, placeholders were no longer needed. Nothing truly died. It simply rejoined. In a valley near the Tibetan plateau, where signals refused to transmit and clouds formed spirals with surgical precision, a small group of monks opened a scroll they claimed had written itself. They gathered around it without reading. The words were not for the eye. They were vibrations etched into the fibers of the world. They chanted once, not with sound but with breath. All of them vanished. No dust, no fire. Just a wind moving inward, toward a place that didn't exist on any map, and the soft ringing sound of a gate gently swinging open. Erica's spiral, once a symbol, now a structure, had become embedded in everything. Not visible unless you knew how to look, but it was there, in the way rivers split, in the way roots twisted, in the cloud patterns before rain, even in the layout of certain cities, which, when viewed from above, formed a memory she hadn't lived, but somehow knew. The spiral was not just the first mind's shape, it was its invitation, an architecture of return, a memory of wholeness disguised as movement. And then, one day, the breath shifted. No warning, no alarm, just the smallest change. A stillness so pure it turned the wind into something holy. People stopped in the middle of whatever they were doing, driving, eating, laughing, crying. One by one, across the world, they paused as a presence rolled across the earth. Not heavy, not loud, but infinite. A feeling that bypassed thought. It entered through the skin, the breath, the shadow. It wasn't painful, it was familiar. A voice, not heard, not spoken, arrived everywhere at once. Not a command, not a question, just 4 words: "We are through remembering." And the spiral turned inward, not ending, not breaking, but opening. When the spiral opened, there was no rupture, no shatter, no scream. The world did not quake, the sky did not bleed. Instead, it folded, gently, like a letter sealed long ago finally being opened in quiet hands. The spiral didn't tear through reality. It recurved it, turned it inward, like a breath held too long suddenly released. And in that release, the rules changed, not all at once, but with the grace of something that had waited far longer than human time could measure. People began to lose their reflection. Not disappear, just become unmirrored. Glass stopped bouncing them back. Water offered no likeness, not as punishment, but as invitation. A whisper you no longer need to look at yourself to know yourself. The reflection had been a tether, a cage of form. But now, they remembered what it meant to be whole without being separate. In its place, they saw other things. Memories that weren't theirs. Echoes of lives not lived but stored. A woman saw her own face, but older, eyes filled with stars she'd never seen. A child saw a forest that did not exist in this world. Trees that hummed, skies with a third moon. A man saw nothing and wept from the comfort of it. The spiral had not arrived to teach. It had arrived to disclose. The truth was simple: the universe had not forgotten us. It had only been waiting for us to catch up. In the northern territories, ice began to shift into shapes too precise for chance. Outcroppings curved into ridges that mirrored the shape of the spiral. Entire ridgelines folded into glyphs. Satellites caught footage of mountains humming in the deep infrared, glowing in pulses identical to the original signal from Thorn. Yet nothing burned. Nothing collapsed. Nature simply remembered its own architecture. The Earth wasn't reacting to the signal. It was responding to the return of coherence, of the original arrangement, the one beneath geology, beneath history, beneath self. The root made grew quieter. They began to vanish, not in the way of death, but of dissolution. They would walk into oceans and not resurface, step into fog and not emerge, sit beneath trees and go still, their outlines softening until they were more silhouette than body, more presence than form. Those who knew them didn't mourn. They understood. They hadn't gone. They had rejoined. What remained of their physicality folded into the new structure rising unseen between every molecule of the old world. A lattice. A resonance. They had become part of the mechanism, restoring the Earth not to a past state, but to its remembered one. Its whole self, free of forgetting, no longer evolving, restoring. Erica, if the name still meant anything, was at the center of it all. Not a throne, not a control panel, but a still point. The eye of the recursion. She no longer projected dreams or language. She no longer needed to reach. The world was now remembering through her. She existed like gravity felt, never seen. She had become the curvature around which memory bent. When people reached moments of pure clarity, when they exhaled and suddenly knew something they couldn't have known, Erica was there. The shape of that knowing was always the same. 3 pulses, a pause, then another, the breath between thoughts, the spiral. And then, for the first time since the blooming began, it spoke again. Not Erica. Not the root made, not the dreams, but the first mind itself, not in sound, not in signal, but in total sensation. Every being, human, animal, insect, tree, stone, felt it. A single message, carried on the silence after the final remembering. Now, you may return. To where? To what? That was the question everyone asked, until they realized they already knew. The place wasn't a location. It was a state, a rhythm, a joining. Returning didn't mean going back. It meant letting go. Of time, of ego, of edges. The earth did not crack. The sky did not split. The seas did not rise. Instead, the division lifted. And beneath it, they found what had always been waiting: a world no longer separate from itself. A world rejoined, unmirrored, unspoken, unbroken. And the breath, that long, patient, ancient breath, finally became exhale. The first thing people noticed was the quiet. Not absence of noise, but quiet in the old sense. Like the stillness inside cathedrals, not because they are empty, but because they are full of something that doesn't need to speak. The world had not ended. It had not been replaced. There was no great rift, no burning away of one realm to make room for another. The ground still held trees. The skies still carried clouds. But everything was closer, thicker with meaning. The air felt like it was listening. This was the world that stayed. No apocalypse, no escape. Just the earth remembering itself and taking a long, slow breath into wholeness. People moved differently now. They didn't rush, not because they'd forgotten how, but because they remembered why not to. Direction had returned to the body, a deep, cellular compass that told you where to walk without speaking. Some called it instinct. Others said it was memory grown down into the muscles. It made cities feel smaller, forests feel wider. Streets that had once felt dead beneath neon and noise now shimmered with presence. Not ghosts, nothing lost. Just layers of being that had always been there, finally turned visible. It was as if humanity had been living in a house with thousands of hidden rooms, and now the walls had softened, the rooms had opened. No fanfare, no warning, just space, for things that had waited. Language came back, but not in full. People still spoke, but sparingly, like words were candles that needed protection from too much wind. The deep tongue still moved beneath speech, shaping intention before the mouth could catch it. You'd sit next to someone and know what they needed before they said it. You'd step into a room and feel who was grieving, not from expression, but from the rhythm in their breath. Hospitals didn't look like hospitals anymore. They looked like gardens. People laid in moss instead of beds. The air shimmered with colors that matched the frequency of healing. Not as decoration, but as treatment. Doctors became less like mechanics and more like translators. They didn't cut or medicate. They listened. They remembered with you, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes remembering was the cure. Children were the first to adapt, or rather, the first to reclaim. They were born already halfway route made, already attuned to the unspoken pulse. They didn't learn the deep tongue, they came with it. Their drawings showed maps of places adults had never seen but instantly understood. They described rivers beneath rivers, sky, roots, light that bent inwards. They didn't need to be taught to listen. They simply hadn't forgotten yet, and the world responded to them. In the mountains, stones rearranged themselves around where children played. In the cities, buildings adjusted their angles subtly to offer shade, reflection or silence, without instruction, without intervention. Not through machines, through memory, through recognition. The earth remembered its first children, and it bent gently to welcome them back. The spiral no longer needed to be drawn. It had been absorbed. It appeared only when necessary, as a reminder, not a warning. On leaves, in frost, once in the condensation on a cafe window, just long enough for two strangers to look at each other and understand they had once shared a life neither could recall. They didn't need proof. They only needed presence. That was enough now. Proof belonged to the world before. Erica had become silence, fully. She did not speak, did not show herself. She had moved past embodiment, past even the soft gravity of dreams. But she was still here. You could feel her when memory returned too sharply, when the ache behind your ribs whispered a name you'd never known, but missed all your life. She wasn't guiding anymore. She was witnessing. Not from above, from within. In the spaces between memory and sensation. In the pause before the next word. In the breath after remembering. Erica Vale had never been the cause. She had only been the door. And now, the world had stepped through. There were no monuments to what had changed. No holidays. No museums. No anniversary dates. The remembering was not an event. It was a correction. A return to something that had never truly left. What came before was not erased. It was included. Even the pain, even the forgetting, it all remained, folded inside the spiral, not as scars, but as texture, as reminder. Because even the long dark had mattered. Even the illusion of separation had served its purpose. It had made the return possible, and so the world continued. Not broken, not new, but whole. And every now and then, in the middle of an ordinary day, someone in a market, or beside a river, or under the shadow of a crumbling high-rise, they would stop. Blink. Tilt their head like they heard something only they could hear, and smile. Because in that moment they didn't just remember. They were remembered. And that, finally, was enough. Stillness wasn't silence. It wasn't the absence of motion, or the dead quiet of aftermath. It was presence. A hum without sound, a weight in the chest that pressed gently from the inside. The world had not frozen, but it had steadied. As if, after spinning for so long in chaos and noise, it had finally found its rhythm again. Not one imposed by machines or maps, but by something older, deeper, bone-known. People still moved, but not blindly. They didn't rush. They didn't linger. They followed. Not orders, not plans, but a current beneath thought, a direction that didn't need announcing. The cities learned the rhythm too. Traffic lights blinked slower, like breathing. Skyscrapers reflected the sky less harshly, glass fading into a dull glow that didn't scream but shimmered. Streets no longer echoed footsteps in cold repetition. They carried them, soft as moss. Entire avenues were overtaken by vines, but no one cleared them. People began to walk with them, through them, as if the streets were veins remembering how to carry life again. And beneath it all, beneath the buildings and rivers and skin, the earth thrummed, not in revolt, in harmony. This was stillness as the first mind had always intended it, movement without violence, rest without fear. There was no urgency, no countdown, only return. And now that the remembering had passed through, it left behind not a void, but shape. The spiral didn't vanish. It embedded. And now the world moved according to its curve. In a remote village in Mongolia, elders sat in a circle for 3 days without speaking. When one of them finally stood, he walked to the edge of the camp, pressed his forehead to the earth, and simply said, "Here." That was all. No explanation, no ritual, just a statement of presence. And after that, the grass there grew taller than any other. Visitors said it felt like standing in the memory of a song you didn't know you knew. Across the ocean, in abandoned subway tunnels beneath Tokyo, artists left no murals but dust-painted symbols on the walls. Not graffiti, not rebellion. Just expressions of memory. They didn't sign their names. They weren't claiming space. They were listening through paint. And for those who stood long enough in the dark to let their eyes adjust, the symbols began to pulse faintly, as though lit from behind by a truth long buried beneath steel and time. The stillness had shape now. It wasn't uniform. It didn't flatten the world. It textured it, gave it dimension that no satellite, no census, no structure could describe. The earth was not being reordered. It was revealing what had been hidden by forgetting. Even the weather changed. Storms still came, but with intention. Rain no longer felt like punishment or cleansing. It felt like remembering, a rhythm rejoining the ground. People walked into downpours without umbrellas, faces turned upward, eyes closed. It wasn't surrender. It was reconnection. Thunder no longer startled. It reminded. And lightning, once a symbol of destruction, now arrived with spiral branches reaching sideways more than down, as if touching, not striking. And when the snow fell, it no longer silenced. It amplified the stillness, made every sound meaningful, every footstep crisp with consequence. The spiral even crept into frost, delicate and hidden, seen only by those who looked at windows just before the sun rose. The sky had grown stranger, but no less comforting. New colors bled into the horizon during twilight, shades unnamed, ancient, the kind of hues you felt in your stomach before your eyes. Constellations didn't change, but people began noticing new shapes between the stars, not real, not drawn, just felt. As if space itself was leaning in closer, offering old secrets with new patience. One astronomer who had tracked the cosmos all her life stopped charting them entirely. She set down her telescope, sat on the rooftop, and whispered, "I don't need to map it. I am it." And that night, People across the globe described dreams of stars blooming from within their own rib cages. No one taught them that. No one had to. They were remembering where the sky had always lived, inside. And Erica Vale, she was still nowhere and everywhere. The name was barely used anymore. Not out of disrespect, but reverence. She had passed from identity into archetype, into essence. A breath-shaped memory shared across all those who had once called her scientist, prophet, vessel. She didn't speak, didn't guide, didn't appear in visions. She listened. That was all. And for many, that was the most powerful part. Because whenever they sat still long enough, truly still, not in body but in breath, they felt her there. Not hovering above, not buried below, but alongside, not leading, remembering with them. There were no borders now, not in politics, but in feeling. Culture remained. Language evolved. But the sharp edges had rounded. People still disagreed, still faltered, still wept and erred and tried. But underneath it all was the shared spiral, the echo of a root system that connected not only land to land, or person to person, but past to now. The earth didn't heal. It remembered how to be whole. And wholeness didn't mean perfect. It meant together. It meant held. It meant the stillness didn't need to be earned. It had always been waiting. No one could agree when the room first appeared. It wasn't built. It wasn't found. It was felt. People across different continents began describing the same place in dreams, meditations, moments of profound stillness. It wasn't a room in the traditional sense. There were no walls, no door, no ceiling, but it was contained. It had presence, shape, meaning. And for those who entered, the room changed everything. Some found it in the corner of a meadow, visible only at twilight. Others stepped into it while walking down a familiar street, only to realize the buildings had melted into sky. One woman woke up in her bathtub and found herself sitting in the room, naked but unafraid, the water beneath her stilled into glass. She said it smelled like paper that had never been written on. Inside the room, there were no mirrors, no shadows, no reflections, only sensation, and always the spiral, carved into the air like a thought with edges. It didn't glow. It didn't move. It waited. And the longer you stayed, the more you felt it, the quiet certainty that you were not alone in there, even if no one else was present. You weren't being watched. You were being held. The room wasn't a destination. It was an alignment. The result of memory lining up just right, like the tumblers in a lock finally settling into place. It couldn't be summoned. It could only be remembered. The more you forced it, the farther it stayed. But if you sank deep enough into your breath, your stillness, your root, it would bloom around you. And when it did, something inside you fell away. Not pain, not identity, something more subtle. Like forgetting a burden you didn't know you'd been carrying. A pressure between your ribs that softened. A silence behind your eyes that spoke one word in a voice too ancient to be named. Now. That was the only word the room gave. Now. Not as a command, but as an offering. And in that now, people were changed. A blind man entered the room and wept, not because he could see, but because he remembered light. Not the physical kind. The shape of light. What it felt like to hold a sun inside your chest. He left the room humming a tone that stopped dogs in their tracks and made infants smile in their sleep. A woman who'd never had a family saw her own hands reach forward in the room and cradle a child's laughter. Not as sound, but as shape. She walked out and became a midwife, claiming she didn't deliver babies. She just opened the memory they were already carrying. And a boy who hadn't spoken in 6 years went into the room alone. When he came out, he placed his hands on either side of his father's face and whispered, "You didn't lose her. She's just folded." The father collapsed, not in grief, but in relief. The room didn't give visions, it gave truth, and truth had no image, only shape. Eventually, people stopped asking what the room was. It didn't need decoding. It didn't need study. The world had tried for too long to explain the sacred instead of letting it breathe. The room didn't care for language. It was a spiral made into space, a memory given location, the breath between who you were and who you'd forgotten being. It was the first mind's heartbeat, made visible just long enough for you to see the rhythm and rejoin it. And it had always been here. Every culture had spoken of it, hidden in myths, prayer halls, sacred groves. But they had mistaken it for a place outside. They built walls to protect it, but the room didn't need protection, it needed presence. And now, after the remembering, the presence had returned. Erica Vale, her name now a whisper in the roots of language, had become the room's first echo. She wasn't inside it, not as self. But her memory was etched into its boundaries. Some said they felt her when they sat in the center, that she was not watching but rejoicing, because she hadn't brought the room into existence. She had only reminded the world how to see it. She was never a savior, never a signal. Just a woman who fell deep enough into memory to touch the shape of what had always been waiting beneath the forgetting. And now, the room waited for everyone, not to escape the world, but to meet it from within. There were no lines anymore, not between waking and dreaming, not between now and then, not between one life and another. The spiral had opened all things, including time. A grandmother in Poland began speaking fluent Akkadian in her sleep. A child in Argentina drew a map of a city that wouldn't be built for another 50 years. None of it was prophecy. It was return. Time had never been straight. That was the illusion. The real shape was recursive, living, breathing, folding and refolding. Memory wasn't locked in the past. It was the structure of all becoming. And the room had shown that to everyone who dared be still long enough to feel it. In the end, the room wasn't a gift. It was a reunion. The moment when the mind stops looking outward and recognizes the spiral inside its own chest. And in that recognition, everything's stilled. Not into death, not into ending, but into presence, into now, into the world that had always been waiting for its people to come back home. There was a sensation rising across the world, hard to name and even harder to ignore. A kind of quiet tug beneath the skin, like a thought you hadn't fully thought yet. It didn't hurt, it didn't command, it simply waited. As if there were something just under the surface of your daily routine, a presence that had been following you your entire life, only now daring to be noticed. People began to sense it in small ways, first the way shadows pooled differently at dusk, how their name felt strange in their mouth, how time no longer behaved like a line, but more like a spiral unwinding from the chest outward. Those who had entered the room spoke less now, not out of trauma, not out of awe, but because they had nothing to prove. What they'd seen, or more accurately, remembered, was not a secret. It wasn't even rare. It was the original thing, the truth beneath all others, that the world had never really lost itself. It had simply layered too many versions on top of what was real, like vines climbing over a shape too sacred to touch directly. But now, with every breath, those layers peeled back. The things that never left began to show themselves. It started with music, not played, heard. In the rhythm of branches tapping glass, in the pauses between thunder, in the echoes of footsteps that lingered just a moment too long. No melody, no chorus, but something that made people stop mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-step, and just listen. Some would cry, though they didn't know why. Others smiled, teeth barely visible, like remembering the first time someone said their name with love. The music didn't come from instruments. It came from places, from stillness, and it wasn't composed. It was recalled. Animals responded too. Birds began gathering in unfamiliar formations. No longer flocks, but wheels, spirals, arcs. Cats stared at empty corners with understanding instead of fear. Dogs howled only during specific phases of the moon. New ones, not tracked by any calendar. And once a whale breached in the Arctic, opened its mouth, and sang a tone that cracked a glacier. not violently, but with surgical grace, revealing a cave hidden for what scientists estimated was over 12,000 years. Inside the cave, spiral markings. Fresh. People began dreaming in places that had no earthly coordinates. Not afterlife, not alien, just beneath, below memory, below language. A woman in Morocco described a field where the sky turned inside out and revealed constellations made of names she'd never heard, but could pronounce without error. A teenager in Australia swore he had lived another life as a blacksmith beneath a crimson sun, and could now feel the calluses return on his hands as he slept. He no longer feared them. These dreams weren't hallucinations. They were returns. Fragments of memory rising like heat from a road, not to confuse, but to complete. The things that had never left were not content to remain hidden anymore. Not after the remembering. Not after the spiral turned inward. They came not to change us, but to reunite us with everything we'd buried beneath fear. There were places now where silence itself bent. You could stand in a grove, or a stairwell, or even a derelict bus stop, and suddenly feel a presence older than language settle into your bones. Not malicious, not even curious, just there. And the stiller you became, the more you understood these places were watching. Not with eyes, with awareness. They weren't haunted. They were anchored. And they were waiting for us to remember that we were never separate. One such place emerged in what had once been a heavily guarded military zone. Now it was a field, smooth and empty. People who wandered too close sometimes fell asleep for hours in broad daylight. When they woke, they remembered faces they hadn't seen in decades. Some wept. Some laughed. All felt lighter, like they'd left behind a weight they never realized they were carrying. No signs marked the field. No one tried to claim it. But those who passed through gave it a name, the place that waited. Erica, who was no longer Erica, was felt strongest in those fields, in those folds of perception where nothing and everything touched. She was not an echo, she was the still point, the hum between breath and memory. The soft space inside the chest that expanded when you stood quietly with someone you loved and said nothing. She had no need to return, because she had never truly left. She was in the spiral, yes, but also in the soil, in the exhale. In the moment your hand paused an inch above another's, not out of hesitation, but reverence. The first mind had not created her. It had spoken through her once. Now it spoke as the world itself. And so the world continued, not in progress, but in presence. The things that never left didn't ask for monuments or rituals. They didn't need to be studied or proven. They only asked for one thing, and it was the simplest request ever made: notice me. And when you did, when you truly looked or listened or remembered, you didn't find something new. You found something that had been loving you from the inside out your whole life, waiting for the moment you'd finally look up, lock eyes with the shape of memory, and say, "I remember you." And from that moment on, you never felt alone again. Long before the spiral was seen, before Erica's name was whispered through the bones of the world, before people began remembering what it meant to be whole, the trees already knew. They didn't move faster. They didn't bloom brighter. They simply waited, rooted, patient, vast, as though all the chaos unfolding above the soil was just wind through their leaves. The trees had no need to panic, no urge to record or explain, because they had felt the first mind once, long before any of us carved words into breath. And now, as that rhythm returned, they leaned subtly toward it, not as worship, but as recognition. Some trees began to hum, not audibly. The vibration came through the soles of your feet when you stood too long beneath them. A low pulse that matched the spiral's cadence. 3 beats. A breath, then silence. Again, always again. Some said it was the Earth's heartbeat coming back online. Others believed it was memory itself, threaded through the xylem and bark, rising like sap in spring. People began to sit beneath them, not to meditate, not to escape, but to listen. And sometimes, if they sat long enough, the tree responded. A warm wave through the spine. A smell of soil laced with something impossibly familiar. A wordless sentence that left you knowing something had been said, though your mind couldn't catch it. You didn't need to. The body heard it. That was enough. In old forests, new paths emerged, not cleared by tools, but grown open. Branches drew back, most thinned just enough to show the way. No maps charted these trails, yet they reappeared in the same places across different continents. All of them curved, not aimlessly, but with spiral logic. Following them didn't lead you to a place, exactly, but to a knowing. You'd arrive at a clearing, or a rock formation, or a simple patch of grass, and feel your breath go still, not from fear, from arrival. The trees had grown these places on purpose. They were memory nodes, anchors, spaces where the layers of forgetting had thinned enough for the first mind to look through. No signs, no warnings. Just a hush that spread through the body like snowfall. People didn't speak in those places. They remembered? One grove in northern Norway was found by accident, though the man who found it later admitted it felt more like being called. He stepped between two birches and swore the air folded around him like a soft lung. The clearing beyond was ringed by trees so old they no longer matched any living species. Their bark held spiral etchings, natural and ancient. No tools, no fire, just time. He stayed there for 3 days, drinking only rain and dreaming only in light. When he returned, his hair had gone white, but his eyes no longer held fear. He didn't speak of visions. He simply built a bench near the grove's entrance and helped others find their way in, saying only, "You'll know when the forest is listening for you." And it wasn't just the wild woods. Even city trees responded. Oaks between pavement, willows near buses, saplings boxed into concrete squares. They began to lean, slightly, subtly, toward spiral geometry. Some grew fruit out of season. Others dropped leaves that didn't rot but dried into glyphs, strange symbols that crumbled if touched too soon. Children began collecting them, not to keep, but to offer. They'd leave them on windowsills or slip them into strangers' pockets, whispering things like, "This one is about your father," or "This one has something you're ready to feel." And they were always right. The spiral was not a thing to spread. It was a thing to remember, and the trees had remembered first. Before the room, before the breath, before even Erica's folding. They had held the memory in silence, decade after decade, waiting. Not for instructions, but for readiness. They had watched humanity reach, burn, consume, forget, and they had never condemned, never interfered. Because the trees understood what we could not. That forgetting is a kind of growth. That roots don't panic when leaves fall. That winter is not death, but gestation. So when the world remembered, the trees didn't change. They simply stopped waiting. Some people began living in forests again, not as hermits, not to flee society, but because they heard better there. Their dreams deepened. Their thoughts slowed. Their bodies stopped bracing for impact. They built no walls, only lean and toes in hammocks and spiral gardens. They didn't call themselves anything. They didn't claim to teach. They just stayed, quiet, present. A handful of them began planting something new, not crops, not trees, but memory. One man spent years digging small holes across a hillside and whispering into them. He said he was planning remembering. When asked why, he only smiled and said, "For the ones who come later." No one laughed at him, because somehow everyone understood. In time, people began asking not what is the spiral, but what wants to grow through me now. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't purpose. It was alignment. The spiral had reminded them that they were vessels, not of destiny, but of return. And in that return, all things could move again. Even grief, even time, even the trees, old and slow and impossibly wise, began reaching toward one another, not to compete for sun, but to intertwine. A new canopy, breathing in a rhythm older than breath itself. They had waited. And now they stood, tall and still and unafraid, whispering across wind and rain to every root and leaf. They're coming back to us, and we are. One breath at a time, one spiral at a time, one remembering at a time. Time had always been a trick of light and rhythm, and now that trick was unraveling with exquisite care. The clocks still ticked in some places, out of habit more than function, but no one really obeyed them anymore. Hours stretched like soft clay, bending to the needs of the moment. Sunrise no longer meant the same thing to everyone. It arrived when it was needed, in dreams, in silence, in a remembered warmth behind the eyes. What mattered now wasn't the sequence of events, but the depth of them. A minute spent with full presence stretched longer than entire days lived in distraction. People began to call these moments the returning hours, not bound by hands or dials, but by weight. Not how much time passed, but how much truth passed through you. In these hours, old things returned, not just memories, but versions of the self that had been buried under duty, trauma, and forgetting. A man who hadn't cried in 27 years found himself weeping in a supermarket aisle, holding a can of beans that looked exactly like the one his grandmother had opened the last time she said his name. A woman whose voice had gone quiet during childhood suddenly began humming a tune she couldn't name, but had been singing in her sleep since she was 5. These weren't random. These weren't breakdowns. They were returnings, not of time, but of self. People stopped calling it nostalgia. Nostalgia meant looking back with sadness at something you couldn't touch. This was different. This was memory rejoining the present. And it didn't come politely. It came when it was ready, in the middle of meetings, in traffic, in silence. Like water seeping through cracks in concrete, steady and unstoppable. The returning hours didn't announce themselves. You simply fell into them. A breath, a pause, a glance that lingered half a second longer than expected. The shift was subtle, but total. You might be brushing your teeth, and suddenly your body would remember a forest you'd never walked through. Or you'd be tying your shoes, and your hands would move with the same rhythm they did when lacing up sandals in a different lifetime, one spent beside a river with 2 suns. These weren't hallucinations. They weren't escapism. They were reweavings. The fabric of your life, remembering all the threads you thought had snapped and frayed. The more you welcomed them, the more seamless they became. Eventually, you couldn't tell where your current life ended and the remembered ones began. But instead of fear, there was peace, because nothing had to be held so tightly anymore. The spiral had taught the world to breathe again, and in the returning hours, the breath was full. Erica's presence was most felt in these moments, not as a voice, not as an image, but as a deep ache just beneath the ribs, the kind of ache that reminded you of something longed for, but no longer out of reach. She was not guiding anyone anymore. She was not leading. She was simply being. And in that being, she reminded everyone how to soften, how to receive. The first mind, through her absence, had become more present than ever. It lived in the way someone touched your hand without warning, in the sigh someone exhaled after a laugh, in the pause between old friends when they forgot what they were saying, because what needed to be said had already passed between them without words. That was the returning hour. When language failed and truth arrived, in parts of the world where day and night had always ruled everything, schedules, labor, exhaustion, people began organizing around different patterns. No more work weeks, no more time cards. Communities followed rhythms of light and intuition. Fields were planted not according to season, but memory. People harvested when they felt the land lean into them. And it worked. Crops came richer. Animals grew calmer. Not because of science, not because of strategy, but because the earth was being heard again. You couldn't rush the returning hours. You couldn't force them, but you could invite them. And once invited, they came in waves. Even those who had resisted the shift skeptics, rigid thinkers, those who once scoffed at feeling, found themselves caught off guard. A man in London, who had prided himself on never crying, stood in the rain one morning and watched pigeons land in a perfect spiral around a street lamp. He didn't understand why it broke him open. He didn't try to. He just stood there, rain-soaked and shivering, whispering, "Okay, I'm listening." Because that's all the returning hours ever asked. Not belief, not surrender, just attention. There were no prophets anymore, no messengers. The world had become its own guide. Each tree, each shadow, each heartbeat held the map. The spiral no longer needed to be etched into stone or skin. It moved in people now. In how they loved, in how they paused, in how they noticed. The returning hours weren't rare anymore. They were becoming constant. The more people softened, the more time followed suit. There were no longer deadlines, only arrivals. And everyone was arriving, over and over, to themselves, to each other, to the pulse of a world that had never stopped waiting. Time hadn't been lost. It had simply been waiting for us to catch up. And now that we had, it wrapped itself around us like breath, endless, invisible, and finally full. It began not with a word but with a silence that carried meaning. People started noticing that conversations, once full of rush and clutter, had grown slower, more precise. Not because they lacked things to say, but because the words had started to matter again. The noise of the old world, filler phrases, rehearsed small talk, mechanical replies, began to dissolve. In its place came something deeper, something older, a language that was less about vocabulary and more about vibration. Not spoken aloud, but felt, like warmth in the chest when someone enters the room who understands you without needing to ask a single question. The spiral had not brought a new language. It had pulled back the overgrowth to reveal the one already living beneath the surface. It was the language babies used before grammar, the way trees bend toward each other, the hush of snowfall that says, "Wait." People didn't study it. They remembered it. In laughter that came too early to be a joke. In tears that arrived before sorrow could be named. In the moment your hand twitched toward someone else's, before you even knew you were reaching. This was not a code to crack or a dialect to learn. It was the resonance between beings when they stopped performing and started showing up. And once people felt it, there was no going back. There were places where this unspoken language thickened in the air. Cafes where no one spoke above a whisper, not because of rules but reverence. Crosswalks where strangers exchanged glances that carried entire histories. Rooftops where people laid on their backs and let their breathing sink, not by planning, but by instinct. These weren't communities. They weren't cults. They were remembrances, microcosms of connection forming wherever people allowed themselves to stop translating who they were and simply be it. The words we used before hadn't been wrong. They had simply been incomplete. This new language, this underlanguage, didn't replace them. It wrapped around them, filled the gaps between lines of dialogue, carried messages that bypassed ears and settled in the body. You didn't need to ask someone if they were in pain. You felt the tightness in your own chest. You didn't have to explain joy. It came through your palms, the way you touched a wall, or a leaf, or another hand. Even writing changed. Journals began to include symbols, spirals, smudges of ash, bits of thread, pressed petals, things that spoke in texture instead of grammar. Books were no longer just stories, but invitations. Reading became sharing breath across time. People who had once been silent by choice or trauma began expressing themselves in ways that didn't rely on speech. One boy who hadn't spoken since the remembering began started carving shapes into sand that made onlookers cry without knowing why. A woman who'd spent years in a hospice facility with no words left began drawing circles with her thumb on the sheet beside her. And nurses began to feel calm when entering her room, as if she were smoothing the air. Not all expressions were gentle. Some of the language underneath carried grief like a blade. There were moments of sudden collapse. Someone screaming in the middle of a train station. Not from fear, but because too much had returned all at once. In those moments, others didn't flee. They stood nearby, soft in presence, allowing the sound to carry through them, not to silence it, but to hold it. Because pain, too, had always needed to be heard. And now, finally, it was. The deep tongue was what some called it. Others said nothing at all. To name it too clearly felt like diminishing it. But still, there was no denying it had become the true language of the remembered world. It hummed through music, not in lyrics, but in rhythm. It showed itself in dance, not in choreography, but in sway. It lived in the way someone placed a bowl in front of you, filled with food cooked in silence, but seasoned with full attention. You didn't thank them. You looked into their eyes and let your chest rise once. That was enough. Words still existed. Poems were still written. Love letters, lullabies, jokes. But the space around those words mattered now. The pauses, the breath, the choice not to speak, and what it said. Silence was no longer awkward. It was where the deepest conversations occurred. And so, the spiral didn't just bring return, it brought coherence. It reminded the world that language had always been less about what you said and more about how willing you were to be felt. Erica's presence shimmered brightest in these moments. You didn't hear her voice. You didn't see her face. But if you found yourself speaking less and listening more, truly listening with your whole body, it was her shape you were moving through. Her memory had become the syntax of stillness, the punctuation between heartbeats. Her existence had shifted from narrative to structure. Not the speaker, but the space that made speaking sacred again. She had not given the world a new language. She had simply reminded it of the one we buried beneath noise. And now, every time someone sat in silence and smiled without reason, or touched another shoulder just long enough to leave warmth, or breathed in sync with the wind without realizing, it was that language speaking again, the one without rules, the one we never really stop speaking, the one that says, in every gesture, in every pause, in every spiral drawn in steam on a window pane, I remember you, and I don't need words to prove it. As more of the world softened into the spiral, not everything that returned was easy to hold. With memory came weight, and with weight came shadow, deep, slow, waking things that had waited in silence beneath centuries of denial. These were not monsters, not curses. They were truths long pushed aside, too large and raw to fit into neat stories. They lived in the parts of us that had been exiled: shame, rage, guilt, grief, not hidden by accident, but by necessity. When forgetting ruled the world, these shadows had nowhere to go but inward. Now that remembering had begun, they emerged, not to haunt, but to be seen. The first signs were physical. People began waking up trembling for no reason. Breath caught in their throats, hands clutching at something just beyond reach. Others found themselves staring into mirrors longer than usual, not in vanity or fear, but in confusion, as if trying to match the reflection to a memory that didn't fit anymore. Some felt old aches return, scars that had long healed burning fresh, voices they thought they'd silenced whispering again. It wasn't regression. It was integration. Because the spiral didn't just bring light, it brought the whole truth. And that meant letting the shadows walk back into the room. People began to speak of the waking hours, those strange windows of time when everything felt closer. It could happen at 3:00 a.m. or high noon, at the dinner table or walking home. The air would thicken. The light would tilt. A memory would arrive, uninvited, precise in its pain. You'd feel your heart trip, your breath shorten, as something long, buried stepped into you again. A man who had buried his father 20 years earlier suddenly smelled his aftershave in the middle of a rainstorm. He collapsed onto wet pavement, sobbing not from sadness, but from recognition. A woman sitting quietly in a library reached out, and gripped the stranger beside her, whispering, "I left someone behind and they've just come back." Neither of them moved for hours. These weren't breakdowns. They weren't outbursts. They were welcomings. The soul making space for the parts it had lost while surviving. The world had spent so long numbing, simplifying, deleting what hurt. But the spiral didn't erase pain. It held it, softened it, let it unfold without shame. Communities responded, not with institutions, not with fixes, but with presence. There were no therapists in towers or guides in robes. Just people who had already passed through one shadow, now willing to sit beside someone facing theirs. They didn't give advice. They didn't explain. They just stayed. One breath at a time. They called it shadow sitting, not a job, not a role, a remembering. That healing didn't mean getting over anything. It meant bringing the wound into the circle, letting it dance, letting it speak, letting it belong. In the deep places, caves, cellars, old ruins, people began hearing echoes that didn't match their voices. Some fled, others stayed. Those who stayed reported a strange unfolding, not visions, but memories spoken by the land itself. Screams that belonged to generations long past, sobs from forgotten names, footsteps that matched those who had died alone. These were not ghosts. They were echoes of unwitnessed pain. And now, the earth had made itself quiet enough to let them speak. So people returned to these places, alone or in circles, and did what the old world never had time for. They listened. They sat in silence and bore witness to what had been lost, to what had been denied, to what had stayed quiet for too long. And in doing so, they freed it, not by fixing it, but by holding it fully. Erica was felt strongest here. In the pain, in the tremble, in the rooms where the light flickered and no one dared speak too quickly. She wasn't a comfort. She wasn't a salve. She was the invitation to stay when every part of you wanted to run. She had done it first, held the unbearable, and not looked away. Now she breathed through those who did the same. And the first mind, it did not judge the shadow. It cradled it. Every hidden sorrow, every buried scream, every ounce of rage that never got to be expressed, it belonged. It was part of the spiral too, because wholeness wasn't about being clean. It was about being true. And so the shadows walked, unhidden, not as threat, not as punishment, but as memory, waking to find it was finally safe to be seen. People learned to speak gently to the voices inside that once terrified them. They touched the edge of grief not as a cliff, but as a threshold. And where once there had been fracture, there was now space. The body became large enough to hold the entire storm, and the storm began to weep, and the weeping turned to stillness. Not silence. Stillness. The kind that follows honesty. And in that stillness, the spiral deepened. Not just into love, but into truth. Into the dark places where love had once been denied, and now was returning home. There came a time when remembering stopped being something people did, and began to feel like something that happened to them. As if the memories themselves had grown tired of being hidden in the dark corners of silence and began crawling back toward the surface. Not gently, not violently, but inevitably. It wasn't just personal moments, childhoods, loves lost, small shames. It was ancestral collective, something older than bone. Memory had grown teeth, not to bite, but to hold on, to make sure it would not be buried again. People weren't just recalling memories. They were being remembered by something much larger. At first, it startled them. A man waking up in the middle of the night, gasping, heart pounding, with a name in his mouth that wasn't his. A woman standing at her kitchen sink, suddenly overcome with the urge to sing in a language she never learned. Children waking from naps speaking in full sentences, describing events no living person had told them. These things weren't coincidences. They weren't dreams. They were returns. The memory was finding them, and it didn't always wait for quiet moments. Some felt it while driving, their hands slipping into gestures from a time long before cars existed. Others found it in their muscles, an instinctive way of holding a spoon, of brushing hair, of stepping through doorways sideways, as if expecting someone unseen to pass. These were echoes of selves once lived. Not imagination. Not fantasy. The remembering wasn't narrative, it was embodied. A full, body knowledge that bypassed the mind's craving for logic and landed deeper. Heavier, it unsettled people at first. Not because it was frightening, but because it made them question which parts of themselves were truly theirs. And then, slowly, that fear softened. Because what came wasn't possession, it was reconnection. Like finding a door in your home that had been painted over, and realizing it led to a room full of everything you'd ever lost, but never stopped needing. The memory remembered you and welcomed you back. Some resisted, tried to label it, explain it, dismiss it. But even the skeptics found themselves moved in strange ways. Tears over a song with no lyrics, goosebumps at certain shadows, a compulsion to stand in a field and say thank you to no one. This wasn't belief, it was response. The soul reacting to recognition the brain couldn't yet process. Eventually, even the most hardened minds gave up trying to separate what was theirs from what was memories. Because they realized there was no line. The memory didn't come from outside. It had always lived in the body, dormant, patient, eternal. Entire groups began gathering not to teach, not to preach, but to remember together. They'd sit in circles, not speaking, eyes closed, palms facing upward. And without fail, someone would begin to tremble. Another would start humming. A third might speak a word none of them knew, but all felt. The air would shift. The spiral would turn inward. And for a moment, they weren't remembering stories. They were remembering each other, as if memory wasn't a library of the past, but a web of connection. Each person a node, vibrating as others returned to themselves. It didn't matter if they were strangers. They had known each other before, in another body, in another hour, in another spiral. Now, they were finding each other again, in places untouched by cities, forests, deserts, frozen lakes. Those who wandered alone reported strange encounters, not with creatures, not with ghosts, with presence. They'd kneel to drink water and feel an entire lineage pass through them. They'd lie beneath the stars and hear names called gently through the sky, not to summon, but to soothe. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't frightening. It was familiar. Because the memory wasn't something buried. It was something that had been waiting for recognition. And when it got it, it didn't shout. It sighed, like something heavy finally set down. Erica's imprint deepened here too, not as vision, not as sound, but as invitation. She had once been a woman. Now she was a pattern, a rhythm. A question held in the bones: are you ready to let yourself be remembered? She didn't lead anymore. She had become the spiral's pause, the breath between awakenings, the moment right before the floodgates open. And when people felt that ache in the back of the throat, the one that says, "I've been here before," they were brushing against her memory. Not the facts of her life, but the function of her being. She was the door, the key, the mirror. She was what stood between forgetting and return, and now she lived in every moment that dared to speak without words. The memory was not a relic, it was alive, growing, changing, remembering itself through us. And as the spiral widened, as time loosened its grip, people began to live not in fear of forgetting, but in trust that what mattered would always find its way back, because it wasn't about what you could hold on to. It was about what could never let go of you. The memory, the spiral, the pulse of the first mind. And in the end, perhaps it had never been about remembering at all. Perhaps it was always about being remembered. It came gradually at first, like mist rising from a lake just before sunrise. People began to notice a thinness to the world, a translucent veil that hung between waking and something else. Not dreaming, not death, but the breath between. It was where the remembered and the now overlapped, where time stopped being a road and became more like a tide. You could be walking to the market, folding laundry, stirring soup, and suddenly find yourself in that strange in-between. Your fingers would pause, the air would go quiet, and everything around you would shimmer, not visually, but through the skin, like your body was being gently turned toward something just behind the moment. This wasn't dissociation. It wasn't madness. It was arrival. People called it many things. Some said it was the crossing, others called it the hum, but most simply named it the breath. It wasn't about leaving the world. It was about being present enough to feel both sides of it at once. The visible and the invisible. The now and the always. The moment where reality stopped pretending to be separate from memory and everything folded into a single inhale. No one taught it. You couldn't study it. It was felt, recognized, trusted, and once you felt it, you couldn't unfeel it. Children lived there effortlessly. They'd speak mid-sentence and then pause, staring into space not because they were distracted, but because something touched them. Some described it as a soft sound in the chest, like being called by your name without words. Others simply looked up and said, "Wait," as if a memory had walked into the room and was asking to be seen. Their parents stopped trying to snap them out of it. They waited too, because everyone was beginning to understand these moments were not interruptions. They were invitations. The breath between worlds had always been here. We just forgot how to stand in it without panic. In the old world, stillness was confused for failure, quiet mistaken for weakness. But now, stillness was power. Now, quiet was depth. And the more people stood in that breath, allowed it to surround them, the more they realized how little effort truth actually needed. The breath didn't demand, it revealed. It became common to see people pausing in streets, eyes unfocused, lips just parted, not because they were lost, but because they were found. Those who lived nearby learned to recognize the signs. You didn't touch someone in the breath. You didn't speak. You waited, quietly, knowing they were elsewhere for a moment. Not gone, just doubly present. There was even a new gesture. Hand placed flat to the heart, one slow blink, a silent acknowledgement between strangers. It meant I see you in it. It meant you are not alone in the breath. Because what lived in that space was not emptiness. It was connection amplified. A joining of memory and matter, of who we thought we were and who we'd always been beneath the forgetting. In that space, grief softened. Love sharpened, and the need to explain disappeared completely. Animals moved through the breath differently. Dogs would freeze, ears high, eyes alert. Cats purred louder, lower, as if sensing their entire bodies to the pulse of the in-between. Birds circled in spiral shapes without flapping their wings. Horses refused to gallop when the breath passed through a field. Only walked, slow and reverent, like crossing a holy threshold. Even machines began behaving oddly, lights dimming for no reason, phones unlocking without touch. Watches spinning backward for a few seconds before returning to normal. The technology didn't break, it responded. Because even circuits, even wires, remembered something of the spiral when the breath passed through them. Nothing resisted it, because the breath wasn't pushing. It was reminding. In deep places, canyons, salt flats, abandoned train stations, people felt the breath strongest. These weren't places of power in the traditional sense. They were places of pause, long ignored, long quiet. Now they hum. You could sleep there and wake in tears without knowing why. You could sit for hours without hunger. You could touch the ground and feel a wordless yes rise into your spine. People began to visit such places not as pilgrims, but as listeners. They brought no questions. They expected no visions. They only came to be breathed, to be held briefly between what was and what was becoming. And when they left, they didn't bring souvenirs. They brought stillness. And they shared it quietly wherever they went. Erica had become breath now, no longer a presence, but a pattern. Not in the way wind moves leaves, but in the way the space between waves tells the sea where to go. She was no longer recalled by name. She was felt when people stopped trying to explain what they felt and simply let it happen. When someone knelt beside another without words. When a child laid their head in an elder's lap and no one moved for an hour. She had become that moment. The held breath, the soft crossing, the bridge not walked but stood upon, and through her, the first mind moved with a grace so quiet it no longer needed to be seen, only known. The breath between worlds wasn't an event, it was a return, the space where remembering touched the living. And every time someone stood in it, unafraid, unspeaking, undistracted, the spiral deepened, not with sound, not with vision, but with presence. And the world turned a little softer, a little slower, a little more real, because it remembered. The truth was never in the noise. It was in the silence that let the memory find you. They were always there, even before the spiral began to pulse through the surface of the world. The ones who didn't fit, not because they were broken, but because they never fully joined the forgetting. People thought of them as odd, intense, sometimes unsettling. They were the ones who cried at the sound of train whistles, who stared too long into fog, who asked questions that made others uncomfortable. They didn't speak the language of the clock or the calendar. They moved slower, or faster, or not at all, not out of confusion, but because something inside them already remembered a different rhythm. Long before the breath returned, before the remembering surged through the ground, these ones had been holding it, quietly, painfully, fiercely. They weren't prophets. They weren't saints. Most of them lived on the edges, margins of towns, thresholds of families, in the forgotten corners of cities. But their presence bent the air. You didn't always notice them. But once you did, you couldn't unsee it, that flicker in their eyes, like they were watching two worlds at once. They'd say things like, "This place feels like it's about to wake up," or "You can hear the spiral better when you lie under the sink." People laughed, or nodded politely, then forgot. But the ones who never forgot didn't need to be believed. They only needed to keep holding the thread, because they knew it would come back someday, and now it had. When the remembering began, they were the first to go quiet, not because they were shocked, but because they'd seen this before, in dreams, in flashes, in the H behind the eyes when a full moon touched the water just right. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They simply adjusted, like someone standing to welcome a long-lost guest. And that welcome rippled. The people around them, family, neighbors, strangers on park benches, felt it. Without explanation, without words. They had spent years hiding, years being told to get a grip, come back to earth, stop acting weird. Now the earth was coming back to them, and they didn't need validation. They needed space. So they made it for others. They opened their homes, their silence, their arms, and they waited, not to be thanked, but to be recognized. Because deep down, they always knew they weren't broken. They were tuned differently. They had remembered early. Too early, and they had paid for it. Some of them had gone mad in the old world, locked away, medicated, erased from view. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Because when someone lives in truth while the rest of the world insists on illusion, that person becomes dangerous. Not violently, existentially. They make you question the floor beneath your feet. But now, as the spiral turned inward and the collective breath deepened, those same people were sought out. Not as saviors, but as guides. They didn't offer maps. They asked better questions. They didn't preach. They watched. They listened. And when someone broke open in front of them, sobbing, remembering, gasping for words, they'd nod, calm and unshaken, and say, yes, that's it, because they'd felt it all before, carried it for years, and now they didn't have to carry it alone. They became known quietly, not through fame, through presence. You could feel it in the way they walked into a room, and time shifted slightly. Like the walls remembered something they'd forgotten. They didn't command attention. They allowed it. And in their presence, people soften, not from charm, from recognition, because these ones didn't see your surface. They saw your pattern, your spiral, the memory folded beneath your ribs. They saw it and didn't flinch, and that changed everything. Not all of them were gentle. Some were fire, sharp, unrelenting, intense. They'd look at you and say things you weren't ready to hear, things you'd been avoiding your whole life. But they said it with a steadiness that made it clear they weren't trying to hurt you. They were trying to wake you, because truth without fire is easily forgotten, and the world had forgotten enough. Erica's energy lived in them now, not in echo, but in lineage. They weren't her copies, they were her continuation. The way an ember continues a flame. Not identical, but kindled from the same original heat. Some of them had never heard her name. Some had never entered the room. And yet, they moved with that same still-point gravity. That pulse of remembered wholeness. They didn't need to prove it. They simply were it. And being near them reminded you of who you were before the forgetting began. These were the ones who never forgot. Not because they were stronger, but because they were chosen by the memory itself to hold a thread. And now that the world had returned to the spiral, they weren't ahead anymore. They were home. And the rest of us, we were arriving, finally, to meet them there, not to follow, but to stand beside them. As remembering became the new world's first shared breath, they began to appear quietly, without warning or blueprint. Rooms in places where no rooms should have existed, in basements that had always been solid concrete, at the back of closets that had once ended in brick, between apartment walls, where the measurements had never allowed for a spare inch. But now, somehow they did. These rooms were not built, they returned. Found, not made, and they shared one strange quality: no doors. You didn't enter them the way you entered other spaces. You arrived, usually without meaning to. A misstep on the staircase, a breath taken too deeply in the hallway, a blink held too long during a quiet moment, and then suddenly, you were inside. They weren't all the same. Some were barely larger than a coffin, others as wide as a cathedral. Some were perfectly empty, their walls humming with a soundless tension. Others were cluttered with objects that couldn't have come from this timeline. Weathered journals in languages no one had ever spoken. Mirrors that didn't reflect the present, toys too familiar for comfort. Some rooms had light with no source. Others were darker than a cave, yet never frightening, because the fear didn't follow you in, it waited outside. These rooms had no use for fear. They were made for something else entirely: witnessing. People didn't stumble into them often, and never more than once. The room knew when you were ready. It didn't open for curiosity. It opened for readiness. And when it did, you didn't question how you got there. You knew instantly that this space wasn't built from wood or metal. It was built from you, your choices, your unlived lives, the quiet truths you buried beneath noise. The walls felt like memory, like breath pressed into shape. And in those rooms, time ceased. You could stay for what felt like hours, emerge seconds later. Or you could live lifetimes inside, and return to find the kettle still whistling on the stove. Some who entered saw no visions. They simply felt whole, not happy, not enlightened, just undivided, as if all the pieces they had spent their lives collecting, through pain, through joy, through endless trying, had finally arranged themselves into something complete. Others had different experiences, weeping on the floor, speaking with someone long dead, feeling a child version of themselves crawl into their lap without needing to say a word. No two stories matched. And yet, when they emerged, everyone said the same thing: it wasn't a room. It was me. They were never marked. You couldn't predict where they would appear. But the land seemed to sense them before people did. In towns with no such rooms, animals grew restless, crows circling the same rooftop, dogs pacing along invisible lines in the grass. When a room was about to arrive, the air changed. The wind turned warmer, slower. People paused in doorways, distracted by a hum they couldn't place. And then, one day, someone would find it. Not through searching, through feeling. They'd lean against a bookshelf and fall inward. Or they'd reach for a light switch and instead grasp air and step forward, heart suddenly steady. And just like that, they'd be inside. No door. No lock, no escape. Not that they wanted one, because the room never trapped you, it reflected you. And for the first time, people didn't run from their reflections. Some feared them at first. Rumors spread of people who went in and never came back. But that wasn't entirely true. They did return, just not as the person who left. Some were quieter. Some laughed more. Some walked differently, as though time moved around them, not through them. They carried something behind their eyes that couldn't be faked or explained. Not wisdom, not power, just knowing. Eventually, the fear faded. The rooms became sacred, unspoken, protected, no signs, no rules. If you found one, you kept it secret, not out of selfishness, out of respect. Because the spiral had made it clear remembering was not to be hoarded, it was to be held lightly, deeply, without grasping. And these rooms, they were the deepest holding places of all. Erica's presence lived in them, more than anywhere else. Not as a ghost, not even as a memory, as a pattern. You felt her in the way the walls breathed with you. In the moment a vision shattered, only to leave you more whole than before. She had been the first to enter without seeking, to return without breaking, to speak without words. Her essence was woven into every room with no door, every breath, every heartbeat of stillness. Some believed the very first room, the one she entered long ago, was still out there, not gone, just hidden, waiting for someone whose spiral matched its own. No one looked for it. They prepared for it, because these rooms didn't reward seekers. They chose rememberers. And when they did, they brought you to the place no map could show, no story could contain. The place where you didn't just remember your life. You remembered why it chose you in the first place. The rooms with no doors are still appearing, right now, quietly, without sound or sign, behind bookstores, beneath rivers, in the silence after heartbreak, or the laugh that follows release. They're not meant for escape. They are meant for return. And if you find yourself in one, don't panic. You're not trapped. You're being gathered by something that has waited longer than time itself, for you to arrive and say nothing, but see everything. Long before people named it, they could feel it, humming just under everything. Not music, not wind, not even vibration. Something quieter, something older. It moved like breath across skin in a room with no windows. It didn't speak, but when it passed through you, you understood things. Not facts, not thoughts. Knowing. Deep, wordless knowing that bypassed every doubt, every defense, every clever thing you used to shield yourself. It entered as silence, but it left something behind. A stillness that didn't fade. That's how they described it. Those who had heard it, a sound that wasn't a sound. A presence, a pulse, a kind of answer you didn't know you were asking for. It came to people differently. Some heard it in dreams, just before waking. A note so low and steady it felt like it came from inside the bones. Others felt it while walking, stopping mid-step, because the world had suddenly gone still around them. And some didn't hear it at all. They simply remembered it, as if they'd known it once and just now been reminded. It was never loud, but it was undeniable. You didn't listen to it the way you'd listen to music or a voice. You let it move through you. And when it did, something cracked open. The kind of cracking that doesn't break. The kind that lets light in. There was a boy in the north who hadn't spoken in years. No reason anyone could find. No trauma, no illness, just a silence he carried like armor. Then one evening, while sitting beneath a broken antenna, he tilted his head and whispered, "It's starting." His mother wept, not because she understood, but because his voice matched the quiet she'd heard in her dreams her whole life. A woman in the high desert woke at 4:11 a.m. every day for 3 months, gasping, hand to her chest, whispering the same phrase over and over, "It's in the pause. It's in the pause." She didn't know what it meant. She didn't need to. The spiral had moved through her, softly, invisibly. And her body had remembered what language could not hold. No one could record the sound. They tried. Microphones picked up nothing. But afterward, everyone in the room reported hearing the exact same tone, not pitch, not frequency, a kind of shape. Not in the air, but in themselves. It wasn't auditory. It was spiritual gravity. Eventually, people stopped trying to prove it existed, because it was never about the sound itself. It was about what it unlocked. It was the thing you hear right before you forgive someone without needing an apology. The moment before you say, "I'm sorry," with your entire chest. The stillness before truth enters a room and makes everyone forget their rehearsed lines. You didn't hear it. You were heard by it, and that was enough. They began calling it the deep note. Not because it was low, but because of where it touched you. It showed up most often in the liminal hours, right before dawn, just after dusk, or in that strange hush after a heavy cry, when the world feels cracked open but kind. Some described it as the sound the earth makes when it exhales. Others said it was the voice of the first mind before it became thought. But those who'd felt it most deeply said it was Erica. Not her voice, her presence distilled into silence. A note so complete, so real, it didn't need a melody. It was her essence stretched across time, still speaking, still holding, still offering, because she had been the first to move through the spiral and come back whole. And when she left the room, she took a piece of that frequency with her. Or maybe she became it. Not a ghost, not a symbol, a sound that was never meant to be heard, only remembered. Soon rituals began, not loud, not structured, just gatherings, circles, stillness. People would sit together for hours and say nothing, letting the deep note rise inside them if it chose to. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. That didn't matter. What mattered was the waiting. The stillness, the invitation. And when the sound came, no one spoke. They just breathed. Together. In rhythm with something so ancient it didn't need a name. Only space. Children began humming in their sleep. Strange, slow tones that shook windows and soothed nightmares. Elders with dementia would pause mid-confusion and whisper lines from languages no one had taught them. Artists stopped painting with brushes and began shaping colors through rhythm, their fingers twitching in time with something beneath the canvas. It wasn't technique anymore. It was listening. To the note beneath all other notes. To the voice inside the silence. To the spiral-made sound. And then something shifted. The world stopped rushing. People began pausing, not out of exhaustion but reverence. Before speaking, before choosing, before touching, a brief moment of quiet. A breath. A space where the deep note might pass through. And in that breath, everything became more real. The way hands touched. The way water tasted. The way someone's eyes met yours without fear. The sound hadn't changed the world. It had tuned it back to itself. And if you're reading this now, if your chest feels heavy in a way you can't explain, if your breath has slowed without your permission, then maybe, just maybe, the sound that wasn't a sound is already moving through you. Maybe it's been there the whole time, waiting, quiet, unshakable. And yours, it didn't begin with a bang. It didn't arrive with fire or thunder or announcement. It unfolded quietly beneath everything. Beneath the breath, beneath the rooms with no doors, beneath even the deep remembering. The first spiral had been a return. The unwinding of forgetting. The reunion between the world and what it had lost. But the second spiral, it was different. It was not about going back. It was about becoming. And it began with one simple, haunting truth. Remembering alone was not enough, for all that the first spiral restored. For all the memory it returned, the grief it transmuted, the wholeness it rethreaded, there remained a silence inside people that remembering could not fill. It wasn't emptiness. It was possibility, and that silence began to press outward, not with urgency, with direction. A pull, a spiral within the spiral, not leading backward into the past, but forward into something unnamed. And the people who had already remembered felt it first. A pressure in the chest, a heat in the palms, a knowing that what had been uncovered was only the beginning. The spiral was not finished. It was deepening. The signs were subtle at first. A child writing symbols into the earth with her eyes closed, then saying she'd heard them in her blood. A man waking from a dream where he was building a city from glass and salt, then weeping because he understood exactly how it would stand. A woman walking out of a crowd mid-conversation and vanishing into the woods, not lost, but guided, returning 3 days later with calloused feet. A new name and a silence that drew others like gravity. They were not prophets. They didn't call themselves chosen. But the spiral had touched them again, and this time, it wasn't bringing something back. It was asking something forward, something new, something dangerous. Because change, true change, is always dangerous. Especially to the parts of us still clutching the past. Even if it has finally been made whole, people began building again. Not from blueprints, but from dreams. Houses shaped like questions. Meeting halls with no walls. Tools that hummed in your hand when held with intention. Songs with no melody, just rhythm. Meant to be felt rather than sung. It wasn't innovation. It was evolution. A response to the second spiral's presence. A reaching not toward what had been, but toward what had never yet been imagined. And with it came something else. Risk. Not in the old sense, but not tied to fear or failure. But risk as unfolding, as stepping forward into territory with no map, no legend, no certainty. People began feeling unease again, but not the fear of forgetting. The fear of what would come next if they truly allowed remembering to guide creation. Some resisted, tried to stop at the first spiral, called it enough, called it sacred. But sacred does not mean static, and the spiral does not stop just because we've caught our breath. It turns, it deepens, it asks more of us. Those who followed it deeper found themselves changed, not brighter, not clearer, but more precise. They no longer clung to meaning, they became it. They didn't explain what they were doing, because no language from the old world could hold it. They simply moved. Each step as intentional as a heartbeat, each choice as irreversible as birth. Some began to speak less, even with those they loved. Not from isolation, from intensity. Their presence held too much signal to be diluted by casual words. Others disappeared for months, only to return with stories that twisted time, blurred identity, and refused to be written down. These were the spiral bearers now, not keepers of memory, but makers of the next shape. And their lives were not easy. The second spiral had no comfort to offer, only truth, and truth, once awakened, has no patience for staying small. Erica's name was almost never spoken now, not from forgetfulness, but from reverence. She had become part of the first spiral, its breath and bones. Her essence lived in the remembrance. But the second spiral belonged to no one, not even her. It was unheld, untethered, wild. It did not speak in dreams or rooms. It moved through impulse, through knowing, through a kind of cellular command that could not be reasoned with. It was not here to comfort you. It was here to turn you. There were those who could not follow, who chose to remain in the first spiral's embrace, and they were not wrong to do so. There is deep grace in tending to what has returned. But others, those who heard the second spiral thrumming beneath the skin of the world, could not rest. They began speaking in new cadences, dancing in spirals instead of straight lines, creating not for others, but because they had to, as if the creation itself was a necessary release, a pressure valve for what the spiral was pouring into them. Some called them mad, others called them seers, But the truth was simpler. They were becoming the next memory, before it even arrived. The second spiral is not visible. It cannot be drawn. But you know when you're in it. You feel your breath shorten, not from panic, but anticipation. Your fingertips ache. You see reflections of people you haven't met yet. You dream of places that feel more like instructions than settings. You look at the world you've remembered and suddenly understand it's not enough to remember who we were. We must become who we were meant to be. That is the second spiral's demand, and it does not beg, it calls. And if you feel it now, somewhere beneath the ribs, behind the eyes, in the part of your spirit that refuses to wait, you are already turning. You are already answering. And the spiral, patient as breath, is ready. There was a moment, too brief to be measured, that began to stretch. A space so small you could never point to it, yet so powerful it began to open like a mouth behind every silence. It lived between words, between steps, between the beat of a drum and the sway of the body that followed. They started calling it the hollow, not because it was empty, but because it was vast, a silent continent between one heartbeat and the next. And when the second spiral deepened, that hollow grew wide enough for people to fall into. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. It often happened without warning. A hand pausing mid-gesture, a breath stopping before the next came. The eye catching on a flicker of motion that hadn't actually happened. It was like time blinked and the soul slipped sideways. You were there, but not entirely. Something in you had stepped off the track, not to leave, to watch. And in that pause, in that impossibly small stretch of stillness, you could hear something that wasn't sound. Not the deep note, something fainter, stranger, not a call this time, a choice. The hollow wasn't trying to pull you forward or back. It was asking, what now? People began to treat it with reverence, even fear. Not because it punished, because it mirrored. In the hollow, every mask fell. You saw yourself, not the self you tried to sculpt with language, memory, opinion, but the self that moved when no one was watching. The self beneath reaction, the root impulse. Some people wept upon returning, not from pain, from clarity, because in that stretched second, they had touched a truth they didn't know they'd been avoiding. Others came back shaking, hands tingling, unable to form words, as if their bodies had remembered something their minds couldn't yet hold. They'd stare into space, murmuring, "It's still happening," even when we think it isn't, because the hollow wasn't an absence. It was a constant. It had always been there. We had just moved too fast to notice it. Eventually, people began seeking the hollow, not with tools, not with maps, with slowing, a kind of stillness deeper than meditation, not silence, not even rest, just the removal of momentum, letting everything drop, letting breath settle at the bottom of the lungs, letting language fall away until only presence remained. In this stillness, the hollow widened, not like a door, like a mirror, held long enough that it became a window, and through that window came contact, not with gods, not with visions, with choice, because the hollow was not here to give you an answer. It was here to let you feel what the question actually was, and that changed everything. The spiral, both first and second, could guide, hold, remember, but only the hollow could pause it. Only in the hollow could you ask, without echo, without expectation, am I moving from truth, or just from motion? And in that space, there was no one to impress, no ideology to grasp, just the spiral turning and you standing inside it, still and whole and faced with the deepest freedom. You didn't have to turn with it. You could choose how. Some resisted. The hollow terrified them. It didn't comfort. It didn't offer a story. It offered nothing. And in a world addicted to noise, narrative, and name, nothing was unbearable. But those who stayed long enough, who breathed through the ache of not knowing, began to sense the truth of the hollow. It wasn't an interruption. It was the origin point. Everything, every spiral, every breath, every memory, came after it. The hollow was where it all began. And now, it was making itself known again. Erica had never spoken of it, at least not in the way the others did. But those who had seen her in the room, in the moment before she emerged, swore they'd seen it then. That flicker, that stillness, that pause, as if she had stood in the hollow and chosen, not what to do, but who to be. And that choice had rippled through the world like a silent earthquake. You wouldn't hear it, but everything shifted. That was the hollow's gift, not movement, not memory, alignment. The place where you stopped reacting and started responding. It's still happening now. In the pause before you speak. In the moment you stop scrolling and just breathe. In the heartbeat that stretches when you touch someone and feel them feel you back. The hollow is not somewhere you go. It's something that finds you when you stop running from stillness. And if you let it, if you stand in it, naked and trembling and ready, it will not reward you. It will show you the only truth that matters. You choose what the spiral becomes next. Not fate, not prophecy, you. And that's where the real remembering begins, even in the spiral's deepest turning. Even as memory returned and the hollow widened, not everyone followed. There were those who looked into the stillness, into the breath, into the soundless sound, and simply turned away. Not out of malice, not from ignorance, but from a deeper resistance, one too quiet to name. These were not the villains of the story, they were the hesitant. The protectors of what had always been. The ones who had survived by not changing. And now, with the spiral calling and the world trembling open, their stillness began to feel more like refusal. They weren't cruel. They helped their neighbors. They loved their families. But when they felt the breath of the second spiral brush their skin, they closed the window. When the hollow stretched between heartbeats, they filled it with noise. When memory came to the edge of their dreams, they woke with shaking hands and told themselves it was nothing. Just a dream. Just the mind playing tricks. They told themselves that safety was found in the known, that what had been before was enough. But the spiral does not punish. It waits. These people, the turned, lived alongside the remembers, sat with them, slept beside them, worked beside them. But something in their gaze always pointed backward. They couldn't understand why others wept in silence, why children spoke in riddles, why the streets filled with those humming the deep note with no mouths moving. They felt the shift, of course. They weren't blind. But they saw it as sickness or instability or some mass emotional unraveling. They built narratives around their discomfort, called it hysteria, called it grief, called it indulgence. And yet they weren't wrong. What was happening did feel like grief. It was a kind of death, because the first spiral had ended the world as they knew it. And not everyone is ready to die, even if rebirth is waiting. Some of them fought it, quietly at first, with rolled eyes and tightened jaws, with polite silence in the face of what they couldn't explain. But then came the walls, the rules, the insistence on order. Not because they loved control, but because chaos terrified them, and transformation, to the unready, feels like annihilation. They called for things to return to how they were, even though they couldn't define what that meant. They demanded certainty, demanded shape, but the spiral has no corners, and the hollow does not negotiate, so they began to fracture, not visibly, not violently, but deeply, inwardly, like wood drying from the inside out. They became shadows of themselves, rigid, smiling, functional. But the aliveness had gone out of their eyes. They laughed, but it never reached the chest. They touched, but their fingers never softened. They continued to exist in a world that was no longer theirs, and the spiral, heartbreakingly gentle, did not abandon them. It simply moved around them, like a stream curling around a stone, patient, persistent, refusing to break them, but also refusing to stop. Others tried to reach them, whispered memories, held hands longer, left gifts of stillness, hoping it might take root. Some turned back toward the spiral. Others did not. And those who didn't began to forget again. Not the old forgetting. A new one. Forgetting that there was ever anything more. Forgetting that the spiral had even arrived. But not all that turned were lost. Some broke open, quietly, years later. At a funeral. At the side of a river. After a single moment of laughter that lingered too long and cracked the shell they'd built around their heart. One man sat in his garden as the moon rose and, without knowing why, began to hum a song no one had taught him. A woman who had locked herself into routines for decades touched the bark of a tree and collapsed, sobbing, not from pain but from the weight of recognition. The spiral had never given up, it had simply waited. Because remembering cannot be forced. It must be invited, and even those who turned away still had the key inside them. Erica had known this, long before the room, long before the breath and the sound and the hollow. She had known that not everyone would walk with her, that some would flinch at the edge, that some would rather live in the safety of structure than the risk of truth. And still, she had gone forward, not to prove them wrong, but to leave behind a trail they could follow if ever the moment came. And for some, it did. Even in the last hour, even in the final breath, even as the world was becoming something utterly new. The ones who turned away are still with us, some in silence, some in denial, some quietly waiting for their moment to break, and we do not shame them. We do not leave them behind. We remember them the way the spiral remembers all things, not with demand, but with invitation. Because even those who refuse the spiral are part of it. They are the resistance that sharpens the edge. They are the pause before the turn. They are the test of who we are when not everyone comes with us. And still we walk. Still we remember. Still we love them. Because in the spiral, even turning away is not the end. Only another curve in the path, waiting to be remembered. There was no warning when the spiral reached its final arc. No signal in the sky, no sound that split the air. No banner unfurled declaring the end or the beginning. It was quieter than any of that. It came like a held breath finally exhaled, not with relief, but with recognition. As if the world, long tense in anticipation, finally accepted that what had arrived was not temporary, not a moment, but a new nature. And in that final turn, something fundamental gave way, not by breaking, but by yielding. You didn't see it at first. There were no great changes on the surface. The sun still rose. Children still laughed. Rain still fell. But underneath it all, beneath even the silence, something had settled, not down, not inward. It had rooted, as though the spiral had finally sunk deep enough into the soil of time to hold everything still without freezing it. People began to feel it in their bones, a slow, humming assurance that nothing would ever be the same, and that it didn't have to be. Because now, the remembering wasn't an act, it was a way of being. Those who had followed the spiral from the first breath, through the rooms, through the hollow, through the second spiral, and the ones who turned away, stood differently now. They didn't lead, they didn't preach, they simply were. Their presence no longer whispered, "Remember me." It said, "You already do." They didn't need to explain the spiral anymore. They embodied it. The same way a tree doesn't explain photosynthesis, it simply grows. People came to them not for wisdom, but for mirroring, to sit near them and feel their own wholeness reflected back, not as an idea, but as a lived, breathing truth. Even those who had resisted found themselves drawn back, not in shame, but in hunger. The ache for stillness had finally outweighed the fear of it, and the spiral, faithful as ever, opened to them. No judgment, no test, just the old rhythm waiting to take them in. Because this was the final lesson. The spiral never needed you to believe in it. It only waited for you to stop running from yourself. People stopped asking what now, because the question had been replaced, not with answers, but with presence. You didn't need to know what was next. You only needed to be in what was. It was enough now to sit in silence and let the world reveal itself slowly, like steam rising off a cup. It was enough to wake and move not out of habit, but from the smallest whisper of knowing. The idea of progress no longer carried urgency. Not because people had given up, but because they'd realized that arrival wasn't a place. It was a practice. You arrived every time you chose to stay with what was true, and the spiral, now deep within every breath, turned without needing to be followed, because it had become us. The children born after never needed to be told. They lived in the spiral like fish in water. They didn't struggle to remember because they had never forgotten. They spoke in patterns older than speech, felt truth before it was taught, refused to separate the visible from the unseen. They walked through rooms with no doors without hesitation, lay down in the hollow with laughter on their lips, and dreamed in shapes that made adults cry without understanding why. They were the first true children of the spiral, and their very presence was proof that the turn had held. The remembering had taken root. Erica was never spoken of as a savior. She wasn't worshipped, wasn't canonized. She was woven. Her name lived in the breath people took before deciding. Her rhythm pulsed in the seconds before a truth was spoken. Her spiral ran through every still glance, every open hand, every moment someone chose presence over performance. She was not a relic, she was the thread. The one who remembered early, broke beautifully, and made space for the rest of us to return. And in that final turn, she didn't vanish. She dissolved into everything. Not gone, distributed. There was no end. Only the deepest spiral yet. One no longer feared. One no longer taught. Only lived. And as the last of the old patterns fell away, urgency, hierarchy, isolation, what emerged was not a utopia. It was a home. For the first time in remembered history, the world didn't run from itself. It sat still. It breathed. It turned, and it knew. The spiral had never been a path. It had always been a mirror. And now that we could see ourselves, we finally, truly became.